Hello, and welcome to the Season 6 premiere of Super Deep Movie Analysis. I'm actor and filmmaker Lec Zorn, joined for the 12th time by actress and filmmaker Michelle Gussow. And back in Season 1, as the Rocky sequel slash spin-off Creed was about to be released, Michelle and I made episodes on each of the six Rocky movies, then one on the two trailers for the movie Creed, and then finally in Season 2 we did one on the movie Creed itself, and then um, then in season 4 I did an episode on the two trailers for the movie Creed 2, and now finally, nearly a year and a half, well, at least a year and 3 months after its release, now Michelle and I are finally getting around to making an episode on uh, Creed 2 about a year later than I thought we would do it, but glad we're finally getting around to it. And anyway, Creed 2, as was the original Creed 3 years earlier, was released on Thanksgiving Eve. So showing a lot of bravery, because that's the time of year when a lot of the blockbusters get released. And Creed 2 was a success. It had a $50 million budget, grossed $214 million worldwide at the box office, which was not only a $41 million improvement on the original Creed, but also the third consecutive Rocky/Creed movie to actually gross more than its predecessor, which is a very unusual pattern. Typically, sequels gross progressively less and less. So, anyway, Michelle, it was obviously, it's great to be back. It was great to have a new movie in the series, and I remember saying in my episode on the trailers, since this was the night before the movie, and I did see it on opening day. It's gotten to the point now. You see a lot of these movies now, like the Avengers, Harry Potter, whatever. There's a new movie every year or two, but it's gotten to the point now where a new Rocky movie is roughly a once a decade experience.
Oh.
There have been exactly three movies in the last 30 years in the series, although the gap between Creed and Creed 2 is only 3 years, but you had 16 years from Rocky 5 to Rocky Balboa, and then another 9 years to still Creed. So, when a new one comes out, and you're a fan, you really
It's a big
appreciate
deal.
it. Yeah,
I-
yeah,
And the way I see that too is often if you are in a rush to just keep turning out sequel after sequel,
hmm
you certainly amass a number of films, but often quality suffers.
yes, yes, and that is a big risk, and I think with the semi exception of Rocky 5, that's something that for the most part the series has avoided for 8 films now. And I think I've said this many times before. I think one of the biggest problems that Rocky 5 had is that it was made largely because it had to be, because Rocky 4 was so big. Um, and you see a lot of movies in the sequel era, from, and it's often trend-setting movies are good, but there's, the movies they spawn are bad. Like, for example, one of my favorite examples, people forget the original Death Wish from 1974 is a great movie. The problem is it spawned so many bad movies that people forget the original was great. And then it's like The Godfather Part 2, which was the first movie that had a sequential title, at least the first major movie. It won Best Picture, but there are so many bad sequels that people forget that the whole idea of the sequel was good in the beginning.
And the thing, though, too, is I do actually understand the psychology behind it,
hmm
where you've got a good thing going and you don't want people to
Yeah,
lose interest and you want to
yeah,
grab them while it's still. But often, again, that leads to something that isn't as high quality as the last one.
yeah.
I think what's really nice is that you have people who are fans of the Rocky series and they're very loyal to it and are willing to wait.
Yes, yes, and I think with Rocky 5, I think Stallone realized that he forced something out that, and there are still great moments in it, like we said,
Right.
and please go back to that episode on Rocky 5, because we talk about it. I think Michelle and I, at the risk of sounding immodest, I feel like we have done a better job than anybody else there about pointing out both the good and the bad in the movie, and there's a lot of both. I think a little more good than bad, but
You have to be open to it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And um, and I think sometimes films they become bad based on the reputation rather than the movie. Like, for example, I remember when Ishtar came out, it was almost universally hailed, almost like it was an Ed Wood movie.
Right.
And now the general consensus, when you look at recent reviews, most people say, well, it was overblown with the $55 million budget. But if you look at it as a silly comedy, it's not that bad. And its movie has somewhat improved over
its reputation.
Yeah, its reputation
has,
has
yes.
somewhat improved over the years. Where now most people will no longer put it as like one of the worst movies of all time anymore. And I think Rocky Five. I remember when I first started looking at IMDb about 15 years ago, it had a 4.4 on there, and now it's up to like 5.1, 5.2. So its reputation has.
You're probably getting people now who are fans of the series who will take a chance and view it for the first time rather than just simply dismissing it as they may have originally.
Yes, and I know a good number of young people who are fans of the series who weren't even around who weren't even alive when some of the early ones were made. Rocky now has a 5.3, so it's come up from that. Again, it was at least as low as 4.4 at some point. And I think a lot of the young people, they see it maybe without having heard so much about it, without so much bias against it. But anyway, as for Creed 2, one thing that's really interesting to me about it, of course it is a sequel to Creed, but it's almost a direct sequel to Rocky 4 as well.
I don't know about direct.
I think it's close to it because
I think there's that springboard effect.
Yeah.
But to some degree, there's so much left out between what must have happened, and I think that would be an interesting thing for a filmmaker maybe to explore.
Yeah. Oh, it would be.
I mean, because that was my thing. There had to be so much between what happened, like after 4. Before now, to get to that point.
And you're right, but at the same time, the reason I say direct sequel is because the whereabouts of the Dragos were completely unmentioned in Rocky 5, Rocky Balboa, and Creed, and now all of a sudden they're brought back. And I think part of the appeal was to, well,
people are curious as to what happened to a lot of the other characters after that.
So. But anyway, so Creed 2 opens, and you see the inside of a very modest apartment, and then later in a shot of the city, you see a couple of those high-rise apartment buildings that the communists built right after World War II, and you see that's where the Dragos, Ivan and his son Victor, are living now, and. In fact, Dolph Lundgren, who returns after 33 years reprising his role as Ivan Drago, he in an interview made a point that I had never thought of before. I'm glad he did. He likened himself and Victor at the beginning of this movie to Rocky at the beginning of the original Rocky. As far as someone who's living very modestly, who's living in the cold, and getting up early in the morning to go train. So anyway, one thing that the movie did very quickly was answer a question I had, because I always wondered. I knew that this movie was going to be about Ivan Drago's son Victor, and I wondered if he was a product of Ivan's marriage to Ludmila Drago, and that question is answered very quickly. You see this bulletin board with these newspaper clippings, some on Ivan, some on Ludmila. They're in Russian, and then. You see a picture of Brigitte Nielsen, who of course plays Ludmila Drago, holding a baby. That then you can assume at that point that she is the mother of the boy. And then I like the way the first scene develops, where you see Victor lying on the couch, and apparently it's a one-bedroom place, and Ivan gets the bedroom. So Victor sleeps on the couch, and Victor is played by a Romanian boxer named Florian Munteanu, and the only reason I know there's a funny story as to how I learned how to pronounce his name. I kept on looking online and I couldn't find any definitive sources, so I actually found on YouTube a Romanian news broadcast that had a feature about him. So I listened. I picked it out from there.
Isn't YouTube amazing? You can find anything you need.
Yes, yes, and so anyway, then this is I think one of the oddest moments of the film comes in the very beginning when you see Ivan, from behind, and then he just goes up and he nudges his son about right here, as if to tell him to get up.
Well, actually, and my impression of that whole scene, because
Yeah.
one of the things I noticed is he doesn't just nudge him; he actually goes and literally
Yeah,
gives him a shot.
yeah. There's no good morning,
No, and so and it's something because to contrast when we get to later in the film, but at the beginning you're noticing how very, very kind of rough he is with his son.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Very just aggressive, and so that's one thing I noticed that it like,
Yeah.
and that was my take
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah, it certainly, it certainly was not loving. It's certainly, and it's interesting. That's no good morning. Did you sleep okay?
Right.
Whatever. There's no words at all. And then I like the camera work here. You see Ivan go out and open the window to look out to the city, and then the camera pans around, and then slowly you see his face. And it should be noted that Dolph Lundgren, who's now 62 years of age, has aged well. He looks better in real life than he does in this movie. That they intentionally did makeup to make him look like he was all beaten down. And
Well, and that might just be a reflection too of the idea that if he'd had physical damage from being in that fight with Rocky in 4, I mean, he actually got beaten up.
well, I that might have been the motivation, but I thought the motivation was to make him look like someone who's just very depressed. Who's just a very miserable, unhappy person over a long period of time. But that's my.
But I would say along with that, because one thing,
That could
if
be.
you're thinking about it, because I think in my mind, and that's not something, a lot of times stuff will come to me when you see something later in the movie where you start seeing like a pattern of things.
Hmm.
And since to me in the entire movie there were little bits here and there that take you back to Rocky 4.
No, of course, yeah.
So for me it was like, oh, he kind of looks like that because of that miserable beating Rocky gave him. Because that Rocky, well, you got to see in 5 and kind of reference in Balboa that the beating he took from Drago did have a lasting impression.
Well, and even in this movie, he would go on to tell Adonis, that guy broke things in me that have never been fixed.
Exactly. So, ideally, it gets me, my brain thinking, okay, they're referencing, because you always got to see what happened to Rocky as a result of that.
Yeah.
Well, you have the only information you have on what might have happened to Drago as a result of that fight.
Yeah.
You're having to figure out from this movie.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, Stallone had talked about bringing back the character for years, the Drago, and I think he picked the perfect time to do it, because I think that, in the first few years after, probably would not have made a very good character in a Rocky movie, maybe in a spin-off movie. But the thing is, once Drago's aura of invincibility was shattered by the loss to Rocky,
Right.
then obviously he would not have made a good, main bad guy or anything like that.
Right.
But on the other hand, after all these years, it's interesting to see what happened to somebody like that. And of course, we found out it's a very, very sad story. And so you see, it's interesting to get the look at and that Drago was that Dolph Lundgren was 27 or 28 when the original Rocky, when Rocky 4 came out, and then he was 60. He was 28 when Rocky 4 came out, 61 when this came out. So interesting to finally get to look at the character again at a much different stage in life. And you see that he's basically a man who's beaten down, who looks and of course his appearance is put into more context by some things that happen later that we'll get
Right.
to. But another thing that's
Well, you have to remember, not to interrupt, because one of the things that, and I don't even know if we addressed it talking about Rocky 4, but again, seeing this and you think back, and one of the things as far as Drago in Rocky 4 is they definitely were trying to depict him as a magnificent looking
Mm-hmm.
human being.
Yeah.
Just, the way the camera angles were on him, the way his, even after the fact that he was a fighter, but his
Yeah.
face looked flawless.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
all that. And so the contrast between that and now,
it's very powerful. And getting backtracking a little bit to my aura of invincibility comment. I remember when I first heard about Mike Tyson back in 1986, shortly before he became at 20 the youngest heavyweight champion in history, before his record was beaten by Tommy Gunn, who in Rocky Five it said was the youngest heavyweight champion ever.
Right.
But anyway, he went through a lot of very easy title defenses, most famously beating Michael Spinks, who was a lot of people thought was the better fighter, beating Spinks in I think it was 91 seconds, and basically, and Tyson was only 22, and people basically thought the heavyweight division might as well not even exist anymore. But a year and a half later, he lost in a stunning upset to a largely unheralded fighter named James Buster Douglas, who was a 42-1 underdog. And to put that in perspective, in the movie Rocky, the title character was a 50-1 underdog.
Okay.
So that was, but the point is, even though Tyson came back and fought for years after that, people never viewed him the same way because there was no mystique about him. There was no illusion that he was invincible anymore.
Right.
But anyway, so then the movie is, as showing a shot of the city, establishes that the Dragos live in Kiev, Ukraine, which was actually a part of the USSR at the time that Rocky IV came out, but then became an independent state with the dissolution of the country in 1991. And I've never heard anybody associated with the film mention this, but I suspect that they had the Dragos live in Ukraine because that's a very big boxing country. And in fact, two Ukrainians, brothers, Vitaly and Vladimir Klitschko, have both held at least one of the heavyweight title belts in this century. And not only that, but Vitaly Klitschko is now the mayor of Kiev, a city of almost 3 million people. So
Okay.
it's I guess the people of Kiev aren't afraid that he took too many shots to the head to govern well. But anyway, so we see they're living in Kiev, and then we see Victor go and have a boxing match and win easily.
Right.
And then finally, we see Adonis Creed, now played by Michael B. Jordan, and he's out in Las Vegas for another heavyweight title fight. It's said that since he lost to Pretty Ricky Conlon at the end of Creed 3 years earlier, he's won 6 matches in a row since then, and now he's fighting Danny Stuntman Wheeler, who for those of you who need to be reminded, he beat Adonis in a sparring session in the original Creed, and then went on. He was going to fight Pretty Ricky Conlon, but then the two got into a fight at the weigh-in with Wheeler getting a broken jaw. Well, apparently Wheeler recovered and then became heavyweight champion, and now he's got his rematch with Adonis. And it's interesting that the even though this is a heavyweight title fight with the main character, that there's not really a lot of emphasis placed on this fight. It's like the scene is there just to establish Adonis becoming champion. We only see 2 minutes of the fight, and we see Adonis win the belt, and it's really it's like just because the scene has to be there. I mean, they don't place much emphasis on it, as opposed to the first 3 Rockies and then the first Creed, where it ends with a title fight that's very climactic. And then we see that Bianca, played by Tessa Thompson, is still there as Adonis's girlfriend, and we see Rocky, of course played by Sylvester Stallone, is still Adonis's trainer, and as further establishing himself as becoming a crusty but wise old philosopher. Rocky makes some kind of comment about how it's only 3 steps up into the ring, but it's the loneliest climb you'll ever take, or something like that. And so Adonis goes out there and wins the belt, and I remember I was, because you and I talked about the that we were both perplexed why the first Creed contains not just one but 2 mentions of wiping someone else.
Yeah.
I was hoping that there wouldn't be any in this movie, and thankfully they're not.
No.
The closest thing to it is that when preparing for the Wheeler fight, Bianca, in sign language, asks Adonis if he's relieved himself yet.
Yeah.
and Adonis apparently has been studying sign language because he seemed to understand what she said. And of course, as I suspected, as I said back in the Creed episode, I suspected that Bianca's hearing disorder was a plot device to set up storylines in future movies, which turned out to be correct, of course. And so, anyway, Adonis becomes the champion, and then he decides that it's time to propose to his girlfriend of 3 or 4 years. So he goes and asks Rocky for advice, and then I think kind of an odd moment, it's like, I guess Rocky was trying to talk to anybody who either hasn't seen or forgot Rocky 2, because he describes the scene in which he proposes to Adrian in great detail.
Oh yeah. But the thing is, Rocky he is somebody who would have that etched indelibly on his brain.
Of course he would, yeah.
Because it just meant so much to him.
Yeah.
And with Adrian being deceased, I think that is something he would carry with him in detail. So he definitely would have.
No, it's in character. Yes, it's in character for Rocky to do that. Yes, and I thought it was funny more than anything else. Then I will say this though. I mean, Adonis and Bianca took their time a lot more, because they've been together at least 3 years by this point, maybe closer to 4. Whereas, because remember they had it's said at the beginning of Creed 2 that the fight to Conlon was 3 years earlier. So we know they've been a couple for at least 3 years. Or more.
Of course, actually, in reality, people wait longer now.
Yeah, sometimes, but the point is, Rocky and Adrian, remember, they met right before Thanksgiving.
Well, right.
And then because the fight with Apollo was on Thanksgiving the next year, and they were already married with a kid by then. They had been married. They had known each other no more than about 3 months by the time they got married.
Well, and I think, like I said, but that was more typical then too. And if you think about people wait longer now, so it's not something that really jumped out at me that it had taken them that long.
No, I thought it was. My point is that it was a normal relationship, as opposed to Rocky and Adrian. Maybe in 1976 people were marrying that fast.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Sometimes they were. It was more.
Yeah.
It was something that was more expected, that if you were that serious that soon.
So my point was that I think the Adonis Bianca relationship was more rational than Rocky Adrian in that way. But like you said, maybe it was just a difference of the times.
That's what I thought.
But so, about 40 years apart. But and there have been a lot of changes in social norms since then, certainly. But by the time I was aware of people marriages like typical marriages and dating relationships, things like that, I don't think it was probably people were getting married quite as fast as they did in the 70s.
Right.
But anyway though, so then in the hotel room, in a reference to Rocky 2, Adonis gives a long monologue to Bianca to propose to her, only to find out that she didn't have her hearing aid in. And that was a reference to, in Rocky 2, when Rocky didn't realize that Adrian couldn't hear him because she had those big earmuffs on. So then he asks again.
I said.
Yeah. and then he asks again, and she says yes. And what's interesting is that we actually we the Rocky Adrian wedding was actually very modest. In fact, if I remember correctly, even though it took place in a large church, was Mickey the only person there? I mean, I know there were very few, if any.
Yeah, I mean, well, you have to remember that even at that time, because they made a mention of the high income taxes, and so they probably, that's obviously the church that he grew up in.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it would happen there, but probably not being able to afford a large wedding.
Yeah.
At that.
But yeah. Anyway, and the thing is, we actually don't see we actually don't see Bianca's and Adonis's wedding, and I don't even know if it's ever established with certainty that they actually have gotten married yet. I mean, I guess they have, but we actually don't see it.
Yeah.
But maybe they just figured. I mean, the movie's a little over 2 hours as it is. Maybe they just figured that you can just assume they did, and there's so much else to do in the movie anyway that it would just be a distraction. And it could be a deleted scene because there are at least 4 deleted scenes that are available online, and I'm going to get to a couple of them later. But so anyway, let's see. Then we see Victor back in Ukraine, that he has some kind of manual labor job outdoors, and his boss says he's lifting these skids. For those of you who don't know, a skid is what they use like in stores to when you put a forklift under it, to lift large things. And then his boss tells him something about unloading the cement. So obviously the Dragos do not have a glamorous life by any means. And then we see Victor with another fight, and he wins again easily. And then outside the arena, they're approached by a Black American man who we later come to realize is a promoter. We'll get to him later, and he's made some sort of comment that I interpret as saying, that basically he doesn't say it explicitly, but the implication is that it's good news that Adonis has the belt, because now that can set up their big fight. And although interestingly, neither of the Dragos say a word, and neither of them have talked yet at this point in the film. And then back in Philadelphia, Bianca suggests moving to L.A. She is a singer who aspires to be a recording artist, so that would be a logical move. And of course, it would allow Adonis to be close to his mother again. And then we see Rocky looking at pictures on his refrigerator, and we don't understand the significance of it yet. One of them he looks sentimentally at a picture of him and his son, and which has greater significance later in the movie.
Right. I will say that is certainly a theme. Father son.
Yeah.
Father's sons, not just Rocky, not
Oh yes.
The whole thing.
It is, yes. And it really comes together very strongly at the end. And then we see Rocky in the cemetery for the only time in this film, still talking to Adrian, and he says something about calling their son, who Rocky this time addresses as Bobby, and I don't recall Rocky Jr. ever being referred to by that name before. It is established that Robert is his formal first name,
right.
But that's the first time I ever remember that name.
The only thing again, playing psychologist with it, the only thing I thought at the time is like, well, the last time you see he's really uncomfortable being, Rocky Jr. in effect, and Robbie might sound like Rocky, so maybe he decided to start going by Bobby so it wouldn't sound so close.
Yeah, that's possible. And
I mean, you kind of have to speculate since they don't give you a reason.
Yeah, and then that's probably as good a guess as any. And so then that's he just, the scene is, I don't think it's even a minute long, and we don't see if he's still folding the chair and putting it up in the tree, as he did in both Rocky Balboa and Creed 9 years apart. but he mentions that he tried to call their son about 15 times, but didn't know what to say. So, and Creed 2 implied that that father and son had a fairly distant relationship. Rocky made some sort of comment about him and his son talking once in a while, and the son living in Vancouver. So anyway, then we see the Dragos, Ivan and Victor, around Philadelphia, including looking at the statue of Rocky, which ends up having more significance in the next scene with a comment. And then this is a scene in which you know it's a great scene, but it would have been even better if you had gone to see the movie not knowing, that it was going to be about, about Adonis fighting Drago's son. If you just were shocked to see Drago in the restaurant. But anyway, so he walks in, and then the hostess tells Rocky. Rocky walks into the restaurant, and the hostess tells him that there's a big guy's waiting for him, and says you'll know who he is. And it's interesting that the lady who plays the hostess plays the hostess back in Rocky Balboa. Her name is Anna Gerena, Gerena, and she only has 5 IMDb credits, including Rocky Balboa and Creed 2. So it's interesting how much continuity there is. So that means that she's been working at Adrian's restaurant at least 12 years now. So, that's
a decent job.
Yeah. And I guess Rocky's good to work for. So anyway, then Rocky walks over, and it would be so powerful if you didn't know that Drago was going to be in the
there,
movie.
Right?
Yeah, it would be so.
That would be like, yeah.
It would be so powerful to walk over there, and just be shocked.
Yeah, and kind of like with the audience is wondering who the big guy is right along with him.
Yeah. But the thing is, it was known so long in advance that Drago was going to be in the movie. So, anyway, I like Rocky's response. He goes, "Is that you?" And he didn't even address him by name, and
didn't even flinch.
Yeah, and then actually, it's uncertain how well Ivan actually spoke English in the original. For most of the movie, he seemed like he spoke only a few words, but then he seemed to be fairly articulate when he spoke after winning the Apollo fight. Unless somebody had, taught him how to say all that, which seems unlikely. But certainly his English is relatively articulate in this movie. And even if he didn't speak much, English back then, he would almost have to learn some in the ensuing 33 years, especially if he's going to be managing his son's career and dealing with people in different countries.
Right.
But he his first words to Rocky are "nice pictures," and then he mysteriously says "no pictures of me." And I did a lot of thinking about that, because from the public's perspective, that would be the pinnacle of Rocky's career, knocking out the evil empire. Why do you think Rocky would not have any pictures of that fight? I have my theories, but I want to know what yours are too.
Well, why don't you start with that, since you...
Well, I think that probably Rocky, because, of the whole thing, he probably would associate that with Apollo's death, and it's probably something that has been troubling him for many years, and he just prefers to stay away from that memory.
Well, that was my, and I just was curious because you said that, because that was my thought on that, because it was obvious through the sequence of this movie that was something that was still haunting him.
Yeah.
And he didn't, so for him, if there was, that would have been pictures of the man who killed Apollo, and he was blaming himself, and so that's how I looked at it.
Yeah, that's probably, I guess the fact that we, see the same, we have the same opinion on that, we're probably right. And then after, it's interesting that Rocky's response when Drago said no pictures of me, Rocky said something like, he doesn't say no, there's no pictures of you. He said there's no pictures of that. And then Rocky just, just asks why are you in Philly, and then Drago goes, you don't know. And then they go back and forth between showing Rocky and Drago, and then showing Adonis and Bianca eating at a restaurant, and then you see the press conference on TV with the black promoter who we saw back in Ukraine, Buddy Marcel, played by Russell Hornsby, and who's challenging Adonis to the fight, and say that this is the fight that he will take unless he's afraid of history repeating itself, and obviously in a comment meant to provoke Adonis.
Yeah.
And then you see I guess referring to seeing the statue, and that Rocky has a restaurant that people like to visit, that Drago tells Rocky that his country still loves him, but then saying that how everything, the way he said it, everything changed that night, and that back in Russia, he says, and he says an interesting choice of words. He says no one touched Drago name. And then it goes on to say, because of you I lose everything, and then he says country, respect, and then he lowers his head, and then as if it's as if this is the most as if this is the most painful part, then he just says wife. And I can't imagine it would hurt that much to lose someone like Ludmila as a wife, but apparently
it was something we know after. Well,
yeah.
The thing is, what's interesting is that back at the time, that reputation for the Soviet Union was everything.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And that Drago's loss took them down.
Oh, yeah.
And so certainly.
Yes, and then he goes on to talk about he likens himself to a stray dog, and I've thought about it. Would Drago have really fallen that hard over the loss to Rocky? And my feeling is actually yes. And I'll tell you why. It's not merely that he lost the fight. I mean, you and I have seen over the years how one comment, comment, whether it's out of poor judgment or or an emotional reaction, and it can ruin you for life, and it can be, especially in the social media era, it can be played constantly, so that people, people look at you as a subhuman, and it's a very unhealthy trend, and we're basically, a lot of times people are afraid to open their mouths because they just wonder what they're going to say that is going to be harmful to them and used against them. But anyway, my feeling is this: I think it wasn't. I don't think Drago was ruined only because of the loss to Rocky, but I think the comment "I fight to win for me," probably because he lost, that would have been played on TV constantly, and he would have been viewed as a traitor.
But also, just saying "I fight to win for me," the attitude of the Soviet Union is no.
Well, of course,
you're fighting to win for us.
So
here he took a very politically incorrect viewpoint for that particular time there.
Yeah, and so their propaganda machine would have ruined him. I mean, they would have played that TV. They would have played that. They would have played that comment on TV constantly and demonized and dehumanized him. And since it's one of those things. I remember when we did the Rocky IV era, I had never thought about I had never thought about his wife Ludmila, viewing him, like hero worship. Like that she was so in awe of him.
And I had said, because she always,
and that would certainly, if in fact that was, her attraction to him that would, certainly fit, with her, leaving.
Although
Yeah.
one of the things I couldn't reconcile,
Yeah.
because if you watch the end of Rocky Four,
Yeah.
where he's kind of defeated in the
Yeah.
corner, she looks, when she's over by him, she
Yeah.
looks like, she's supportive and concerned, and
Yeah, she does, but then maybe with the onslaught of media
yeah, she
attention
can't
afterward.
handle it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Um,
I'm just saying, for
yeah.
me, I was trying to reconcile that because it looked like at the time
Yeah.
she cared.
Yeah, that's right. And this scene really it shows that even Rocky being in his 70s now, there is a little bit of naivete in him. I think sometimes people who are good natured tend to be naive and not understand that so many other people are not good natured and
Right.
view things differently. And Rocky seems shocked, like you came all this way to tell me this, and then Drago goes on to talk about his son, saying that all he knows is this, and then says, "My son will break your boy." And and keep in mind, even back in the original Rocky, 42 years earlier, when we're talking about the scene where he and Mickey have he and Mickey have the big argument, and then immediately afterward, Rocky goes outside, tracks Mickey down, and they reconcile, pointing out that Rocky doesn't hold grudges.
Right.
So Rocky didn't even hold a grudge against Mickey for 5 minutes, and yet he's he can't believe that Drago still holds a grudge 33 years later about anything, let alone losing a boxing match.
Right.
And
Well, I think all people tend
Yeah.
to, and I think I've said this repeatedly in a lot of situations, is that that's a major problem we just have as a society in general, where we all tend to think other people think exactly as we do.
Oh yeah.
And not just that, we expect that they should. And that's where we end up with a lot of our problems.
Oh yeah.
So that's something that's very common. Now, at least he's good natured with it.
Yeah, yeah, and like I remember Rocky, telling Drago that referring to their fight, he said it was like a million years ago, and Drago said, like yesterday to me, like yesterday to me. And Rocky can't
Right.
understand anybody holding onto a grudge that long, and then I like Rocky's response after Drago says, referring to Victor, my son will break your boy, and then Rocky he won't have any more part of the discussion, and he says, I think we're done here, and then while walking away, he said, we put strays around here, we put strays away. Since Ivan had just compared himself to a stray dog.
Right.
And then, as Ivan's walking out, then Victor walks in, and then you see Ivan just sarcastically say, good picture, not knowing what he's referring to, and then you see it's a picture of Apollo. So obviously, again, an antagonistic comment, just trying to provoke Rocky. And so that was a great scene right there, and the first meeting of Rocky and Drago since the fight. Yeah, I mean they really did a great job with it, and you see how different their lives have been since then. So anyway, so then you see Rocky go visit Adonis at the gym while Adonis is training, and Adonis talks about about Drago, and it's interesting that Rocky makes a comment. This was probably intentional, but Rocky makes a comment very similar to one made by Apollo in Rocky 4, where Adonis asks Rocky if he's familiar with Victor, and Rocky says that he's seen Victor on sports TV, and something like he's big but he's raw. And that's very close. That's very close to what Apollo said about Ivan in Rocky 4. He said something. He said, "I saw this guy box when he was an amateur. He's big and strong, but he's clumsy." So anyway, then let's see here, and then we see Adonis watching on his tablet, watching the Apollo Drago fight from Rocky 4, And it's interesting that the only two times we ever see Adonis watching one of his father's matches, it's the only two matches that his father ever lost.
Mm.
In the first in Creed, we see him watch the fight from Rocky 2.
Right.
So that's a real oddity. No, but and of course, maybe they didn't want to try to create any fictional Apollo Creed matches for Adonis to watch.
Right,
Maybe
yeah.
maybe they thought that would be too much work. I don't know. So then we see a Bianca concert, and then Buddy Marcel, the promoter, shows up there and has a conversation with Adonis, and Adonis obviously doesn't like the guy with good reason. And I will say though about the character that um, first of all, Buddy Marcel is a much more realistic character than George Washington Duke, the promoter from
Right.
Rocky Five, which was a pro wrestling type character. And even though the character was well played by Richard Gant, Richard Gant did a good job with the performance, but the character was too corny for the movie, I felt.
Yeah.
But this is a more realistic promoter, and I mean he's someone who
Sleazy but different.
yeah, I mean, basically, he's a straight shooter. I mean, he knows that it's a sleazy sport, and for him, all he cares about is the bottom line, and he'll do it. Because there's money in the Adonis Victor fight. Marcel will say whatever it takes, no matter how unethical it is, just because he wants to get his piece of the pie.
Right.
So I mean, you get what you see with the character. He's not very likable, but he is probably very realistic and I mean, at least there's no false pretense. I mean, he's not doing anything under the guise of wanting to help starving kids or anything like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
So anyway, but he does make an astute point though. Mentions that there have been 77 heavyweight boxing champions, and pointing to the audience, he said, how many of them can those people name? 4 or 5? And yeah, that's true. Most heavyweight boxing champions, most people have never heard of. So obviously, if you're a good promoter, you got to turn your turn the fighters into big celebrities. I mean, I'm a big fan of the IndyCar series, and especially the Indy 500 and Indianapolis 500, and I've been saying for years that the biggest problem that IndyCar has now is that they haven't figured out how to turn their racers into mainstream celebrities. Basically, even their best racers have little appeal to anybody who's not a diehard racing fan. I mean, even their most famous racers can walk down the street or walk into a restaurant without being mobbed.
Right.
So obviously Marcel, he's right in his approach as far as trying to bring fame to these people, and try to find things that appeal to that are good selling points to the public, especially with boxing really having seen better days. That there aren't really a lot of active boxers who are known to the general public.
And again, since I don't follow
Yeah.
boxing, I will defer to you on that.
Yeah. So anyway, then Rocky goes to Adonis goes to Rocky. Says he wants to fight Victor, and then of course Rocky tries to talk him out of it. Saying that the kid was raised in hate, that he's dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that just a few minutes earlier, Rocky was downplaying Victor's prowess, but now that Adonis wants to take the fight, now it's different. And Rocky makes the comment, that Ivan, referring to Ivan Drago, that he broke things in me that ain't never been fixed.
Right.
And
and there too, it's physically and emotionally.
yeah, and of course, obviously it was a low time in Rocky's life, and very telling that he didn't have any pictures of it at his restaurant. So, and I think another thing is Rocky probably is afraid that it'll be too painful to train Adonis for the fight. That'll bring back too many memories, you know.
Right.
And there probably still is a lot of guilt, you know. And Rocky has, you know, he did acknowledge, um, Rocky did acknowledge to Adonis, you know, in the first Creed that the fight should have been stopped.
Right. And
And
he mentions that again.
yeah,
And he specifically
yeah,
says, I should have thrown the towel. I should have.
yeah,
Even though, like, one of the things I said is, you know, that I guess Apollo's
yeah.
pride or whatever got in the way.
Oh,
Because he was like, if you. You know, he said, if you stop this thing, I'll kill you or something. He was not. He was not having any part of that. So. But I think in this one we finally do get that sense that I talked about, that how guilty Rocky felt, because he talks about like right now I'm losing track of where, but he does talk about how Apollo died in his arms. So
yeah, oh yeah, yep, that's right. And
I think he didn't want to. I think for him there was that. He just couldn't imagine reliving that, and he was afraid. I think in that instance too, he was somewhat afraid of. You know, he didn't want to train him because then he would have had to be there and possibly putting himself in the exact same situation again.
oh yeah, of course, yeah,
Which is what I kind of looked at from that.
yeah. I think you're right about that. And then I think also you're probably worried about Adonis too. You know,
Right.
now that Adonis is, you know, married or getting married, you know. And
Mhm.
so anyway, Adonis feels abandoned, and you know he and Bianca go out and move out to L.A., get a nice place out there, and so now he's closer to his mother again. You know, played by still played by Felicia Rashad,
Mhm.
and you know I think that Michael B. Jordan, Tessa Thompson, um, and Felicia Rashad are all, I think they're all even better this time than they were last time. I think
Mhm.
they're all settling into their roles. I think when you play a character for the second time, you get more comfortable with it.
Right. Or
And
if more of a feel for who the character is and where they're going.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I definitely understand that.
yeah. So anyway, and you know we get to see, you know, I think also Felicia Rashad, she gets more to do this time
Mhm.
as well, and it's a more balanced performance. You get to see, you know, I mean, we saw a lot of what we saw from her in the original was just her toughness,
Mhm.
and you know, we see her, you know, we see gentler aspects of the character in this film, you know,
Right.
and more pleasant, more pleasant traits, you know, where we see that
More
she,
well-rounded
yeah,
character.
it's yeah, exactly, it's more well rounded, and she seems to have a good relationship with Bianca as well, and when it's interesting that when Victor is or when Adonis is about to break the news to her about the fight with Victor, that she believes, she misinterprets that as them telling her that Bianca is pregnant. That's
Mm.
what that's how I interpreted it.
Hmm.
When she asked how far along
Oh,
are you,
yeah.
yeah, and then
Well, one of the things though is with that scene is there's this now I personally I don't think I have any insight at all,
uh,
but it's I guess it's this thing that some women have this instinct about other women.
yeah,
They glow a certain way, or
yeah,
I don't know what it is. I've never been able to tell that, but it struck me with that she was seeing that mysterious glow.
yeah,
So it wasn't even just that she was misinterpreting, it just she was like honing in on that, whatever it is.
yeah,
Because after that, when she goes and does the pregnancy test
yes,
or
yes,
something, yeah,
yeah,
like, oh, so it was that instinct that I keep hearing about. I just don't
yeah.
have any of it.
Yeah, so I mean, I thought of her as I ended up with in this movie thinking of Marianne Creed as a nicer person rather than someone who's just angry and you know
Mhm.
and understand. I mean, I understand she had some reason to be angry and fear of her son fighting after her husband got killed, but um, you do see a more complete person
Right.
in this film, and therefore I like the character more. And so anyway, then Adonis and Bianca take the pregnancy test, and of course it's positive, and so you see more of a repeat of Rocky 2, where there's not only the marriage of the relationship that started in the original, but now the kid as well.
Right.
And of course they, Adonis and Bianca, they don't think the timing is so good, but they, decide to work through it together. And, truth be told, I think the timing of a pregnancy is, it's usually never good, but you just, make the most of it, and,
Mhm.
you know, it's of course John Lennon had a sometimes he oversimplified things, but he did have a lot of insight. He said that 90% of the kids in the world, especially in the West, are here because of a Saturday night and a bottle of whiskey. That's
Right.
oversimplifying it a bit, but not too much. And so um, anyway, so then Adonis tells his mother that he's going to fight um, Victor, and the mother, she isn't happy about it, but she doesn't go to the lengths she did in the original to try to stop him,
Mhm.
from fighting. Like I like the line where she said, "I ought to knock you out myself,"
Mhm.
in the original,
Yeah.
um, and she tells him not to pretend that this is about your father,
Mhm.
um, and you know, um, I think it was. I think actually Adonis said it to Rocky earlier, something like, "He killed my pops. I can't let that slide,"
Right.
as if this will somehow avenge his father's death.
Right.
And that's part of his reason for taking the fight.
Yeah. And I guess
Yeah.
Marianne was seeing through that
Oh
and
yeah.
knowing it was about something else, and if he's using that as the noble reason
Yeah.
that nobody else needs that kind of uh,
And
rationale.
maybe Adonis in his mind, maybe that was his motivation, but I think Adonis, knowing where he came from, I think he would. I think anybody who challenged him, I think he
Mhm.
would fight the person.
Yeah.
Um, and although obviously you do see signs that he is growing and maturing as a person compared to the first as well. And I think you've seen that with Rocky throughout the series.
Right.
Over 8 movies and 42 years. Um, there is growth, and even Bianca. I found her less of a nag in this film than
Yeah.
she was in the first one, and it
Yeah.
could be because you had different writers last time.
Mhm.
Last time it was Ryan Coogler and Aaron Covington,
Yeah,
and
I was gonna say I actually didn't dislike her the way I did in the first
yeah,
one.
exactly. I just thought
I
I thought she was a nag in
Yeah,
the
and
first one.
just I was like, because with the first one, I was like, if they're gonna keep this character going, ugh. And
Yeah,
this time around, it just didn't seem as bad. I mean, so it was like, oh, okay.
yeah. And this time this time the screenplay was by Jewel Taylor and Sylvester Stallone. It was good to have Stallone back
Back
writing.
writing it, yes.
Yeah, because he wrote the six Rockies by himself, but he only acted in Creed. So it's good that he's back co-writing this one. And I would guess probably he wrote a lot of the Rocky parts, and then probably the other guy, Jewel Taylor, probably wrote a lot of the
Mhm.
Adonis parts. Um, but anyway, so let's see. I've got this. I actually made a. For those of you who don't know, I actually made a scene by scene list to make sure we don't forget any scenes this time. Um, so then we see Adonis and Bianca in bed. And speaking of Adonis and Bianca being in bed, one thing I'm thankful for is that there in the entire 8 films, there's never been an overblown, um, love
Right.
scene.
Yes. Thank you.
Um,
Yes.
and the reason being is because I think most of the time such scenes, most of the time they're gratuitous, and most of the time they're distractions.
Mhm.
And my favorite example, my brother Robert McAtee's movie Trail of Crumbs. It's a great mystery drama, and but there's one scene with my brother and this girl who his character picks up at a bar, and the scene borders on softcore pornography, and it's just a completely tacky, um, gratuitous, unnecessary scene in an otherwise great movie. And I think my brother, it was his first time directing, and I think he just wanted to make himself look like some kind of macho stud. And but I think the sad thing is it's a great movie with a lot of important messages, and there were a lot of people who walked away from the movie with that sex scene as their biggest memory. So it's a distraction from bigger things.
Right.
And the one there's like one semi-sensual scene with Adonis and Bianca in each of the two Creed movies, and that's as deep as it ever gets in the series, and which I think it's more than enough.
Yeah.
We know they're in love. We don't need to see anything that
Right.
that goes too far that becomes a distraction. But anyway, they talk about the possible hearing problems of the baby,
Right.
and um, so then Adonis goes and visits the character known as Little Duke, played by Wood Harris, who would not train. He was Danny Stuntman Wheeler's trainer, trained him to the heavyweight championship of the world, but would not train Adonis in the original.
Right.
And so Adonis goes back to Little Duke now, and a Little Duke is, for those of you who don't know, is the character is the son of Duke, who was Apollo's trainer, and then later Rocky's trainer. And this time, Duke, obviously seeing that Adonis has matured and has this big fight coming up against him, and obviously, Adonis beat Little Duke's man,
Right.
Wheeler. So obviously, has earned Adonis has earned Little Duke's respect. So Little Duke signs on to the fight, and then you see Ivan, working his son like a racehorse.
Yes.
And Ivan driving his van around while making Victor follow him. And then at one time Ivan stops the van and gets out, and says in Russian, "When I tell you to run faster, run faster." And then you get a little bit of a training montage, and then Adonis gives an interview, a pre-fight interview, where he says Rocky's taking care of family stuff, or some
Right.
kind of generic comment. And then you go to the weigh-in where Ivan Drago tells Adonis, "You're much smaller than your father." And of course, obviously, Ivan. I mean, one difference between Rocky and Adonis is that Adonis still has something of a short fuse, and then he takes offense to it, and then he and Victor get into a shoving match, and you think they might end up getting into another weigh-in fight, as in the first one with Danny Stuntman Wheeler and Pretty Ricky Conlon, but obviously Ivan is just trying to get into it,
Right. He's trying to
and I
plant
doubt.
the seeds of doubt.
Yeah,
And all that.
and I doubt that Ivan, really, I doubt Ivan, has any joy over having killed Apollo. And in fact, actually, I read a few years ago. I'll have to go try to look this up again. That there was in one of the ideas that Stallone had for bringing Drago back in some of the past Rocky movies. I think there was going to be a scene where Drago was actually having a nightmare about it, but it was going to portray him as actually being very deeply troubled by it.
Yeah.
Which I know that probably the most famous example of a boxer getting killed in a match in my lifetime is when what's his name, Ray Boom Boom Mancini. Yeah, he killed that Korean guy, and it really messed him up in the head. And it's why he retired when he
By
was.
the way, there's an excellent documentary about that, and I forget the title of it.
Yeah, and that
I
fight
saw that.
and that fight actually changed boxing, because that fight. I mean, this fight should have been stopped much earlier, but the referee let it go on to the 14th round, and because of that fight, every
It's
major
like 12 rounds
yeah
now.
every major boxing jurisdiction shortened the fights to 12 because of that fight. But there's an incredibly sad story. I mean, it wasn't just that this guy died, but his mother committed suicide, and then the referee of the fight committed suicide. Um, it was terrible, and I've never blamed Mancini. I've always blamed the referee for allowing it to go on that long. I mean, Mancini at one point in that fight landed 30 consecutive punches. You know, and my if I were a referee, I would stop the fight as soon as I saw that one fighter was unable to defend himself. Um, but anyway, so then we see Rocky alone in the restaurant. In his restaurant, I guess it's closed, and he's watching the fight by himself. And this is a better version. You know how in Rocky 5, even after he was abandoned by Tommy Gunn, Rocky was still nevertheless watching his heavyweight championship match against Union
Right.
Kane, and it's and and so even though Rocky's not training Adonis at the time, Rocky still views Adonis that way as his protege,
Right.
and that Rocky's still telling him what to do, and
Yeah.
it's basically the same concept of the scene from Rocky 5, but done better,
Right. Yeah.
because you don't have all the distractions,
Right. You can't help, but
Yeah.
The thing is, when you're the professional, or whatever, you can't help yourself.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You
But I
just
mean,
can't.
yeah, it's like now you don't have the interference of George Washington Duke or
Right.
anything like that. So it's just Rocky alone, and it was a really good scene. And were you going to say something?
No, I was gonna want to jumping ahead with it because
Yeah.
the thing I always find interesting is that in the Rocky series they always do look to try to find different ways for the fights to end
Yeah.
and resolve. And to me, that was a new one where Victor ended up disqualified.
Yeah, and you're right, and of course, obviously, there's another in the climax. There's yet another way to end a
Well,
fight for
yeah.
the series, but
We'll get there.
Yeah,
But this in itself was kind of, oh, that's a different
yeah,
approach.
and basically the fight was it's reminiscent of Rocky 3 in that you see the champ get into the ring and is unprepared.
Prepared.
Who's not mentally prepared, and maybe in good shape but not mentally ready for it.
Right.
And
Well, the thing is, in Rocky 3, I don't think he was physically ready either.
maybe not, but I mean,
Because you saw
yeah.
that weird kind of. We
Yeah.
commented on that training sequence in that place that was like a party atmosphere.
Oh, yeah.
Mickey yelling at him, "Let's get out and
Yeah.
really train. You've got to fight."
Yeah, where basically fans were allowed to come in, and Paulie was selling merchandise.
Right.
Uh-huh.
So I would say that one he wasn't physically ready for.
Yeah.
But
And-
on this one,
yeah.
I imagine that Little Duke had him physically ready for a fight, but I think mentally he wasn't there on this one.
Yeah, and
Well, and in the corner because his father says he's afraid.
yeah, and obviously, that was the whole thing was Drago wanted to make him afraid,
And it worked. This
both
time.
both Dragos wanted him to be
Right.
afraid. So yeah, we see Adonis, like Rocky against Clubber Lang, unprepared, and he gets beaten very badly, and then starting with Rocky 5, the main opponent of the title character has been a real life professional boxer, Tommy Morrison, Antonio Tarver, Tony Bellew, and now Florian Montano, and yeah, and I think that's made a big difference that these are people, they're not just big like Carl Weathers or mister T, who or Dolph Lundgren, but these are guys who actually really they bring an authenticity,
Right.
with the way that their punching technique and their footwork and things like that. So anyway, then Adonis, is getting beaten very badly, and you can tell by the way that Ivan talks to Victor between rounds that it's the whole it's a whole philosophy of humiliation and brutality, rather than mere scientific boxing. That they
Right.
really, want to just not only beat this guy but demoralize him.
And I noticed the use. One thing I noticed is he was saying "break him," and that was
Yeah.
the word he used in Rocky Four.
No,
I
I must break
you.
Oh, and then he tells
right.
he tells Rocky, "My son will break your boy."
Boy, right. So they've
Yeah.
been using that
Yeah.
again.
Yeah, and
Not just break physically, apparently, break mentally. We've got them.
yeah. My son will break your boy. Yeah, and so then anyway, Adonis goes down, and then Victor, hits him while he's down, and and then basically, and the commentator makes a comment of that, that it should be a disqualification, and we don't know for sure that it is initially, but but that reminds me, this is one of several. I mentioned how Buddy Marcel, the promoter earlier, was more realistic as a promoter than George Washington Duke. Well, similarly, this is a more realistic scenario in another way, because in Rocky Four, while Rocky, you know, should have thrown in the towel, one thing that's never been mentioned that probably would in real life. In real life, the referee would be heavily criticized for not disqualifying Drago for hitting repeatedly after the bell.
Right.
So yeah, in real life, almost certainly Ivan Drago would have been disqualified in the Apollo Creed fight. But anyway, so then we see Adonis wake up in the hospital. He's got a lot of injuries, and one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that psychological injuries are often worse than physical, and Adonis is psychologically battered. For a point of reference, back in 1993, Monica Seles, I think she was from the former Czechoslovakia, one of those Eastern European countries. She was one of the top tennis players in the world, and it looked like she and Steffi Graf were going to be the Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova of the 90s. But then one day in Germany, in a match while she was taking a rest between sets, this rabid Steffi Graf fan came and stabbed her with a knife in the back. And she was rushed to the hospital, and she only had a minor injury. But the rest of her career, she was so paranoid about getting attacked again that she was never the same player. And this isn't a direct parallel, but the point is that injuries can be very psychologically damaging.
Exactly.
And Adonis has other stuff going on in his head anyway. And then anyway, little Duke gets off the phone and tells Adonis that the disqualification has been confirmed and that he's still the champ. And then predictably,
Yes.
predictably, there are some things in the movie that really caught us off guard, but this is the one I saw coming. Of course, Rocky comes to visit in the hospital, and Adonis gets mad at him. And
Yeah.
and so anyway, then Adonis and Bianca return home, and obviously Adonis has a long road ahead of him, and there's a pretty painful scene to watch where this is, I don't know I was surprised to see this in a PG-13 movie, but basically you see Adonis urinating, and there's blood present in his urine, and it's obviously very, very unpleasant to look at. And you see that there's so many different things wrong with him, physically. And then it comes from a scene that I really was surprised how much I liked this next scene. And I'll tell you why. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's stereotyping or the way that men have to have certain types of roles and women have to have certain types of roles in the minds of a lot of people. But usually, I don't care a lot for female-to-female conversations in movies. For whatever reason, I usually just think the dialogue tends to be cliche, and it's not very interesting. But this is one time where I really like the interaction between Mrs. Creed, Mary Ann, and Bianca. Or between Mary Ann and Bianca, where she's giving very good advice. I mean, there's nothing intellectually brilliant about it, but it's just good common sense. And this is a society, as you and I have discussed in recent years. There's a big lack of common sense
Right.
in this country we live in today, and um, so basically, Marianne is just telling Bianca to be there to support him, but understand that only he can bring himself out of this,
Right.
which is true. I mean, something I've learned the hard way in life. People can only be helped to the extent that you're willing to people can only be helped to the extent that they're willing to be helped. You know?
And I guess that was the thing too, because there was this effect that
Yeah.
I thought they did. It's when they were talking, but they were showing Adonis in the pool,
Right.
and when he would go under,
Hmm.
their conversation sounded like you were hearing it
Underwater, yeah.
I thought that was an interest. As a filmmaker, I thought that was an interesting effect.
Yeah, yeah, it was, and
You know, just if you talk about noticing the use of something, and yeah.
yeah, and that was well done, and but yeah, that was a nice moment between. And another reason I like it is that so often, um, parents are really. I think a lot of times parents have unrealistically high opinions of their children and unrealistically low opinions about their children-in-law,
Mhm.
and you know that creates a lot of uncomfortable situations. But you see that this woman is accepting of her daughter-in-law and is
Mhm.
trying to be a good, supportive family figure to her. And it's interesting that in two movies we don't know if Bianca has any family at all.
Right.
I mean, I don't think it's ever been mentioned whether she has parents or siblings or anything else out there. It's really interesting. Maybe it's on purpose in the series because they think it makes the character simpler. There's less to explain. That Rocky was an only child; his parents were dead. Adrian had a brother, but their parents
Uh-huh.
were apparently dead, and so it's
And
been a
yeah.
very small family.
Well, in that way too, you don't have to,
Yeah,
then there's not like that obligation to include more characters.
yeah, that's
Because
probably part of
yeah,
it.
I mean, if her parents are,
Yeah,
that, well, then they'd certainly be in on this birth and everything. You
yeah,
have to write more characters. So
yeah,
I do understand that.
yeah. But yeah, so it's nice, especially since Bianca doesn't seem to have a family. That Mrs. Creed, that Marianne is being supportive, and that she's giving good advice. And I would like to see more, female to female conversations like that. And I think a lot of it is just that a lot of times when people think about actresses, in major roles, they think about chick flick type stuff,
Mhm.
and real like shallow, lightweight stuff,
Mhm.
But this was a nice moment, and um, so anyway, let's see. So and then we see Adonis kiss Bianca on the belly, and
Mm.
it's not nice moment, and then Adonis watches on TV as Victor gets another easy win, and I mean, one of the few times that Victor speaks in the film, he says that something like Creed must fight me or he is no champion,
Mhm.
and
Now that was another time where I actually, my when he said that, of
yeah,
course, I flashed back to Rocky 4 when they're interviewing Ivan after the Creed fight, and he said, "I beat real champion,"
now
and he's using
yeah,
that
yeah,
term. There's
yeah.
so I heard that, and it just to me it just flashed back.
Yeah,
to
yeah,
that.
I didn't think about it, but yeah, that probably, that very well could have been the influence for it. And again, you had Stallone back writing, so
Mhm.
I'm sure that made a difference. I mean, even though obviously Ryan Coogler was a big fan of the series, there's no substitute for Stallone.
Right.
Yeah, for Stallone's writing. I mean, he nobody knows the material as well as he does.
Mhm.
And then, and sometimes scenes in movies they turn out to be more important than they seem at the time.
Oh
And
yeah.
and this next scene turns out to be, I didn't think it was going to be so important at the time, but it turns out to be one of the most pivotal scenes in the movie. Back in Russia, you see that there's some sort of official, I guess, state kind of dinner
Mhm.
to honor Victor's accomplishments. So you see that Ivan is finally starting to get back in the good graces of his home
Right.
country, and Victor looks uncomfortable and out of place, but Ivan's, he thinks that this is his chance, to redeem himself. So he's, taking advantage of it, and Um, Obviously, based on the toast that they give and the different comments that people make, obviously they're very proud of him and they're hoping that he's going to become the heavyweight champion of the world. And then guess who pops in?
Yes.
And
what's that line? She came in like a ship.
Yeah, and guess who pops in? And the funny thing is, I remember when I was going through my the night before the movie came out, when I was doing my discussion on the Creed 2 trailers, I was scrolling through the IMDb page for the movie, and I saw Brigitte Nielsen as Ludmila Drago, and I thought, well, but it was pretty far down the list, so I thought maybe it was like just flashbacks, because sometimes they do, even when you have somebody who's only in a flashback, you're supposed to denote that.
Right.
But sometimes people make mistakes on there, So I thought, I wasn't sure she was really going to be in the movie, like in new material.
Okay.
And so I was fairly surprised when I saw her walk in. And one thing that should be noted is that Brigitte Nielsen was actually 7 months pregnant when she did this role. And so they had to try to cover it up, and that could be why she has such a small role in the film. But, I always say that, as good as she was in Creed 2, her biggest accomplishment of 2018 was giving birth to a baby at the age of 54.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, her oldest child, she was 20 when she gave birth to her first child, so that might be a world's record of longest span of, 34 years, having children over a span of 34 years. That might be a record. I don't know of any others like that, but anyway, so she walks in, and one reason why I was skeptical about whether she would be in the movie is because Stallone, they were engaged during Rocky IV, then got married, and were only together a year and a half. Because I knew that she was only put in Rocky IV, she was not even in. The character of Ludmila was not even in the original script of Rocky IV. Then, because of their relationship, Stallone wrote her in, and then because of their divorce, I was skeptical about whether she would be invited back. But it turned out that she was.
Well,
and
I guess Stallone. I've said this. He puts a lot of himself into Rocky, so maybe he doesn't hold the grudge.
Yeah, and one thing I thought about is that I wonder if he because as much of I do not use the word bitch on a regular basis,
no.
but basically that's what he tried to make her character in the original. Ludmila in Rocky IV was a total stereotype. A stereotype of an arrogant, nasty Soviet bureaucrat, who believes in Soviet superiority and looks down at America. And Stallone accomplished the amazing task of making the character even more loathsome this time around. Really, she was just. I've read some comments on YouTube clips from this movie. One of them said that she was the real villain of Creed 2.
Oh.
Which is pretty amazing because she only has about 2 or 3 minutes of screen time. But yeah, she is just. She seems like she's become an even. My opinion of the character, as far as from an ethical standpoint, was even lower in this movie than it was in Rocky IV, for reasons I'll explain. Because in Rocky IV she was just doing what she was told to do, which is, be a nasty bureaucrat. But in this movie, when we see that she's abandoned her family, to me that's even worse.
Again, if you're going back with Rocky IV, I'm sure post that fight, if she's just your good little propaganda bureaucrat, and they say, if you want to keep your position, you need to sever this tie.
You're right. She might have been told that,
And that's what you do. I'm saying I'm not saying it's not loathsome.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that that's certainly what I could picture happening.
Yeah,
And I hate to say this, at the time in a government situation like that, one does what one must to save oneself.
Oh yeah,
And unless we're
yeah.
ever in that position, you can't really
Yeah.
judge that.
Although that would not excuse her actions in this movie, which we'll get to. Which
No, but we're
yeah,
talking
yeah.
about.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I understand.
Since we're going back to
Yeah.
that.
But anyway, so she walks in and. I've seen two different interviews since Creed 2 came out, two different interviews with Brigitte Nielsen in which she talked about the movie. And I had never seen her interviewed before, and much to my surprise, I found her to be far more likable than I expected. And she said that she was approached by, it was MGM who called her, and this is a funny story. She said MGM called her and asked, "Is Ludmila Drago still alive?"
Oh wow!
and she said that she said yes very enthusiastically. And keep in mind that Brigitte Nielsen has not gotten a lot of roles in recent years.
Right. Well, I know I'd feel just as good if somebody called and asked me if truly Oswald was still alive.
Yeah.
I would do it.
Yeah. So
that's a whole other episode.
So anyway, yeah, she walks in and well, anyway, backing up a little bit, she said that she and Stallone ran into each other on the set, and she described their interaction with each other as friendly and professional. And anyway, she did go on to say, and these are her own words, and what struck me about this is how matter of fact she said it. She said he was a horrible husband. She did not give any and that was the exact phrase, horrible husband, and she said it twice. And she did not give any examples of what he did wrong. She didn't say like he was a jerk or he was a womanizer or he was a wife beater or anything like that. But although she did say that they buried the hatchet and moved on, but then the host asked, "Was the marriage really that bad?" And then she said, "Oh yes," and she emphasized that it was. Although keep in mind their divorce was 33 years ago, correct. So you certainly hope in that amount of time that some feelings have healed. But anyway, but I was surprised that after talking about having been cast, that she still felt no qualms about describing him as a horrible husband. And but I really wondered if Stallone made the character so loathsome in this movie as punishment to her. I doubt it. I don't think he has that kind of. I don't think Stallone has that kind of mentality. I mean, if he really hated her, I mean, he probably could have found another actress to play the part, since it was only a small part anyway.
Yeah.
So I think if he really had that kind of mentality, I don't think he would have put her in the movie at all. But anyway, and I think for what it turned out he was trying to do with the character, he did a great job of it. But anyway, so she walks up, and then you realize who it is, and one that I didn't realize for a long time how tall. She
is.
According to her IMDb profile, she's 6 feet 1 inch, which is about 185 centimeters. And then Dolph Lundgren is credited. I think he's listed at 6'5", which is about 193 centimeters. For all of you who don't understand our archaic measurement system that we still use here in America, but so yeah. And I remember jokingly saying after that movie that if they ever had a kid together, it would be scary. But I didn't realize I knew she was tall. I didn't realize she was quite that tall. But in fact, she's actually created a new career for herself in recent years. She's a frequent guest host on The Talk, which is a famous midday talk show. And she, I've seen her on there a few times. She's very intelligent. She speaks perfect English, and so she adds a lot to the discussions. So, anyway, so she shows up, and she sits next to this guy. I guess it's her boyfriend or husband. I don't know. They kiss on the lips at least.
Right.
And then I just, to me in this movie, I love to hate Ludmila, because I love the way that she just sits down, in front of across from the husband and son who she abandoned, and just shamelessly, talks like there's nothing wrong. And just how brazen she is,
And there again, if she is a creature of duty, then again, we're going back. It was her duty to abandon them for the country, and now it's her duty to be civil at this.
Yeah, and
event.
And the way
and I'm going to say this
yeah.
because if anybody out there has ever had to attend some kind of bureaucratic whatever,
I have, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
you understand that they could put you next to, across from, and you'd better put a smile on your face and a civil tongue in your mouth, and act. Even if you hate that person, you better act like everything's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, and literally, and I say this because, if anybody out there has had to attend, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I actually looked at that whole dinner, if you want to call it, that whole scene, as one of these bureaucratic dinners or whatever where everybody has to put on a fake.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, of course.
I mean, everybody has to put it on, and especially, again, if you're this creature of habit with the sense of it's your duty.
Yes, although I also figured that at least some of it is Ludmila. Now that her son is a celebrity, now she wants to get back, and now she wants to be proud of him, and proclaim that she's his mother, like she's an opportunist.
Well, that too, but I think what I'm just saying is that her. Because literally, I always go one deeper. Everybody knows this about me with the psychology thing, is she could easily do that with her son, maybe, while figuring out a way to wedge out the father. And I think she was like trying to act like everything was fine with him too. And that's where I'm saying where she's putting on a big thing.
And then, she says, hi, Victor, and then she turns to Ivan and said, you must be proud.
Right.
Yeah, and so after she says you must be proud, I like his response where you could tell that's where you start to feel, his negativity toward her,
Mm-hmm.
So then Victor gets up and storms out of the room, and then this is one of the most powerful moments of the film. And, keep in mind that, keep in mind Florian Munteanu, prior to this movie, had his only acting experience was in one German short. That's it. And keep in mind also, since this entire scene is in Russian, neither Dolph Lundgren nor Florian Munteanu speak Russian. They both speak multiple languages, but not that one. And in fact, Florian Munteanu said that he described speaking Russian as a tongue breaker. And yeah, I mean, if you only speak Western languages, yes, it's going to be very hard to pick up. I've tried Russian on Duolingo. It's a very tough language for Westerners, and it's a very harsh sounding language, which I've always thought Russian sounds scary. Which I guess isn't why Russians make such good bad guys in movies.
Yes.
So. But I think German. I took 4 years of German. I think German sounds scary too.
Yes, that too.
But anyway, though, I love and this is the first time where you really get insight into Victor once you scratch the surface of the tough boxer. And it's also where you see that he's actually looking out for his father too. And he asks, "Why are we here?" Well, no, he asks, "Why are we here?" And Ivan has an interesting answer: to build a future. So basically, Ivan thinks that, hey, you win the belt, then we're going to be back, among the royal family effectively, and we're going to have access to all this, high society stuff. And then I love Victor's response that he said, I don't know that woman; she might as well be a stranger. And then he goes on, telling him that these are the people who threw you out, abandoned you, shamed you, and of course, and Ivan initially just does not heed his son's words, and he responds by saying, "I lost, but you won't," as if that somehow makes it okay.
Right.
And the message, whether it's intentional or not, is that that your value as a human being is based on your accomplishment as a boxer, which is a terrible message to send, but if it were not for this scene, then Ivan's actions in the climax of the movie would not mean as much, because at that moment, which we'll get to later, you realize that the seed that Ivan planted when he and Victor talked here in the hallway at the dinner, ended up, you know, making Ivan realize that his son was right by what he said. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And Victor didn't realize it at the time, but he finally did in the end, before it was too late, thankfully. I mean, Ivan realized it
Mm-hmm.
before it was too late. What was important in life, and that his son was right about all these things. And so anyway, but yeah, it's a very emotional scene, and I think that was probably the first time in the movie that I started to feel something for Victor. Because up to that point, I just viewed him as just a brute, and that's when
Mm-hmm.
you see that that there's a pained soul
Right.
underneath that facade, underneath the muscle. And so anyway, then Adonis is parked in his car outside the boxing school, the Delphi Boxing Academy, where I guess Apollo had trained many years
Mm-hmm.
earlier. And then let's see here. Then anyway, little Duke comes out, and they have a conversation, and little Duke says that he's going to have to fight somebody soon,
Right. Oh yeah.
or vacate the title. And anyway, Adonis says he'll be in a few minutes, and then while little Duke is training somebody else, then he sees Adonis drive away. So we see
Yeah.
that Adonis still isn't right mentally yet.
Right.
And then Rocky gets in the and this shows the age of Rocky and Marianne. I talked in their Creed episode about how it's telling of Rocky's age that he still reads a newspaper.
Right.
Then you see that we see that Mrs. Creed, Marianne, actually uses postal mail. She, rather than emailing Rocky or texting him, she actually she sends an ultrasound photo of the baby.
Yeah.
So we see the Creed grandbaby, and then anyway. Oh, and I forgot to say, it's interesting the character of Buddy Marcel, the promoter, largely disappears in the second half of the movie after looking like he was going to be a major character, in the first half hour, 45 minutes. But he does send those boxing gloves to the baby,
Mm-hmm.
and which turns off Adonis. But
Yeah.
Anyway, so
It's probably supposed to.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, maybe that would make sense. But then anyway, so Rocky goes out to L.A. and Adonis comes home and or goes to Marianne's house and sees Rocky, and they have the long conversation, and then obviously any anger that Adonis felt is cooled down by now, and then Rocky has obviously now Rocky's going to train Adonis, and then
Right.
they start talking about the name, and Adonis says Amara, and actually by today's standards, when you look at what when you look at what parents are naming their kids these days, that's actually a fairly I mean, it's only 5 letters for one thing. It's easy to pronounce.
Yeah.
Um, and so actually that's there are some of the names that I hear parents giving their kids these days, I shake my head, and
Mm-hmm.
wonder if they're thinking about the long-term consequences, understanding this is what the kids are going to be named 50, 75 years from now.
Yeah.
So Amara by today's standards isn't really that bad. I don't think it's bad at all, really. And then I like the part where Rocky suggests something simple like Becky or Kate, and then Adonis has a good line. She's going to be black.
Yeah.
She's going to be black. So, I like that. That there are that the movie does occasionally make light about cultural differences, but
Right.
that, and I think this society's gotten so uptight when it comes to anything that has to do with race that I think sometimes people just forget to laugh at each other.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that, for example, one thing I like is that you occasionally um, make um, lighthearted comments about your Jewish ethnicity.
Oh, yes.
Like for those of you who don't know, Michelle a few years ago wrote some article about, was it that there should be a Friday morning football league for
No, it's Sunday. I guess there. Well, yeah. I guess it was. You can find it, and I do have a
yeah,
book out
yeah.
called "If Two Trains Are Traveling in Opposite Directions, I Don't Care What the Apples Cost," and there's a lot of humorous essays about that. But yeah, and there is a takeoff on um, doing football on Sunday or something
Yeah.
for the, and you could have a Jewish league, so
Yeah,
it's in
yeah.
there. Yes.
Um, yeah, because yeah, the Jewish Sabbath would coincide with Friday night, so you got high school football there, and then Saturday afternoon where you got college football.
Right.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, so many people, if you make any lighthearted comment about race, they get offended. So I'm glad that Rocky and Adonis are able to joke about it.
Right.
And I think society would be so much healthier. You know, these days if people would just be less uptight and just be willing to laugh at themselves a little bit.
Right. And I think that, and that holds true for everybody. I mean,
Yeah.
you make fun of your heritage
Yeah.
at times.
Of course
and,
I do.
Yeah.
And one thing I love about the South Park, there are times, the show's offensive, but what I love is that nothing is off limits. That they're an equal opportunity offender.
Right. Absolutely.
But anyways, so then Adonis gets the call about the childbirth, so he and Rocky go to the hospital, and the baby's born healthy, but there's questions about the hearing.
Right.
And there's a scene at the hospital where Adonis no, excuse me, where there's a brief conversation between Rocky and Marianne, where he said something like, "Yeah, I wish I could do something more," and she said something like, "Being here is enough." And I think one thing that's really been missing from the two Creed movies is I'd like to see more interaction between Rocky and Marianne. Although from the little bit of interaction you do see, and from the way she talks about him, there's nothing that suggests that she holds any anger toward him.
Right.
That she blames him for her husband's death. Um, but yeah, I would like to see more interaction between the two. But at least there was a little bit there. There wasn't any in the original movie. But anyway, and also I forgot to mention that in the conversation between Rocky and Adonis back at Marianne's house, Rocky, mentions like Adonis, I think, had made a comment earlier in the movie about Rocky not making any smart decisions lately. And then Rocky commented about that being true and mentioned that he wasn't there when his grandson was born, which is the first time we know Rocky as a grandson.
Right.
Yeah, first time we know Rocky as a grandson, and so I ended up becoming pretty certain that we were going to get to see the grandson at some point in the movie, because I can't imagine that
they bother mentioning it if you weren't.
Yeah, yeah, and but anyway, it's and then you see Rocky in the hospital at one point. He picks up his he goes through this notepad he has, and he sees his son's phone number, and it's interesting that the area code is 604, which I happen to know is the area code for Vancouver. So they're trying to be, accurate. Yeah. And so anyway, he picks up the phone and he tries to call but doesn't go through with it. And anyway, so and the nature of the reason why he seems to be estranged from his son is never mentioned. And it seems like it's probably just an excuse to set up a mushy ending of the movie, and if that's the case, it worked very well, as we'll get to. But
we could assume that that was.
Yeah, but probably. I mean, whatever the nature of their estrangement, it's probably more of the same stuff that Rocky Jr. has this discomfort about it, being in his father's shadow,
Right.
and
And almost like had to separate himself physically to find himself.
yeah, I mean, like I said, he didn't just leave Philadelphia; he left the country and he went to the westernmost major city in Canada, and so anyway, so then they give um, Amara, the newborn baby, the hearing test, and find out that she's hearing impaired as well, and so then this is a scene for me. I can relate to it. I mean, my kids are 14 and 16, so I remember what it was like. The first few times I was left alone with a kid. You don't always know. I mean, parenting isn't an exact science. And I think that
But I don't know if you jumped too, but one of the things I want to talk about
go ahead. Yeah.
was with the hearing, Rocky, that conversation he has with Adonis where he said, and if it's not okay, because they're worried about the test, and Rocky says, and if not, it's not okay, then what?
Yeah.
Huh? And he goes, are you gonna love her?
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
It was like, of course. What kind of a question is that? And I thought that was very poignant, because here they were focusing in on something, the results of this test, like it really, I want to say, mattered about something, at that moment. And it really wasn't going to change how he felt about his daughter.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes people forget about things like that. And, well, none of us, I mean, we all want to have no ailments and for our loved ones to have no ailments. I mean, at the same time, what would the world be like if nobody had ailments? I mean, I remember one thing that I thought was refreshing was, back back in the early years of AIDS, when it was a death sentence. There was a lot of anger. You had some people on. You had hate on both sides. I mean, you had some people, not a lot, but there were some real hardline conservatives who said that it was God's punishment to homosexuals. But then you had other people who were just very hateful on the other side too, who were blaming Republicans and Reagan and Bush for the AIDS epidemic,
right?
Crap like that. But then when Anthony Perkins, when he died, he had not talked publicly during his lifetime, but he did write a statement to be released after his death, and he addressed the people who believe that the disease is God's vengeance, and he said that instead he believes that that it was sent to teach people how to love and understand and have compassion for each other.
Yeah,
and I was really glad that he had that approach and he had looked at it in a positive way. When so many people were looking at it in a negative way, and I remember and keep in mind I no longer am involved in organized religion, but I am a spiritual person. I believe that life has deep purpose. I think we're in this life to learn and grow, and I have this Facebook friend who went through a period of a few years, thankfully outgrew, but where she went through about 6 months where she was just posting this hardcore in-your-face atheist stuff every day. It wasn't just saying this is what I believe, it's like saying that you have to agree with me on this or you're an idiot, And I'm thinking, if I really believed there was no God, I couldn't care less what anybody else believes, because nothing would matter anyway,
right.
But there was one, she showed a collage of deformed children and basically said something to the effect of, the existence of these children proves that there's no God. And I told her I don't believe that at all. I mean, I think that the existence of these children is an opportunity for us to love and to show compassion and selflessness and understanding to the less fortunate. And in doing so, we can become better people. I think some of the times in my life that benefited me the most is, like when I've worked at retail stores and like I've had to help people in wheelchairs or, who had one impairment or another. So I don't think that these things,
right.
I don't think that these things are curses. I think these are opportunities to love and to become better people and to reach out and think less of ourselves and think more of others, which is, I think, what the world needs to do.
Absolutely,
more and more.
Absolutely.
So anyway, back to the movie.
Yeah. Well.
Anyway, I know what it's like. Parenting is it's ironic that if to adopt a kid, you often have to go to all these classes and prove that you're fit
Right.
to have kids, and yet to have a kid on your own, you just have to be irresponsible, and which is pretty easy for most of
Yeah.
us. So we a lot of us find ourselves in over our heads, and I never had any training to be a parent, so it was a crash course, and I fell down a few times, but figured out how to get back up, and
Oh, it's,
you know.
that whole sequence. I'm sorry, what I love, and he's like when he calls his mother.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
I think and that just looks like, you talk about sometimes when watching a movie or a
Yeah.
TV show, if you're seeing something that really looks like you're watching a video of somebody's actual life, that struck me as that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I can't get her to stop crying. What do I do?
Yeah,
I loved it.
Oh yeah, I had similar incidents myself, and it goes with the territory.
Mhm.
And so I enjoyed that, and then he takes the baby to the gym and
Right.
works out, and then we see Adonis, Bianca, and the baby lying together, and
Mhm.
then finally we have the lead into the training montage. Where we have Rocky, Adonis, and Little Duke, and Little Duke gives the news that Marcel is saying that the fight has to be in Russia.
Right.
And
Now, again, just because of Rocky
Yeah.
4, that it was in Russia, yes, I was expecting that.
yeah, and then obviously Marcel, had close ties to the Dragos, and obviously since Victor was becoming a big hero over there, I'm
Mhm.
sure they could get a good deal there. So, and then I remember you mentioned the one reason Rocky had to go for the knockdown is because he wouldn't win a decision.
Right.
And then there's actually a variation of that said here where Little Duke says that if it comes down to a judge's decision, it's a clear advantage to be in his home country. And then
Right.
so Rocky says the obvious: we can't let it come down to a judge's decision.
Right.
So obviously Rocky knows they can't let it come down to the judge's decision. You got to go for the knockout, and
Well, and again with the training sequence,
Yeah.
I love they picked this. They always want to do something a little different,
yeah.
and they went out into this like deserted.
And unfortunately, this scene loses context because of a deleted scene. One of the 4 deleted scenes I've seen. I guess it was supposed to happen earlier in the movie. It was mentioned that Spider Rico, who Rocky fought in the opening scene of the original, and then who became a Rocky's spiritual advisor in Rocky Balboa 30 years later, had died,
Oh.
and Rocky eulogized him at his funeral. And it's a very good scene. Just you can see it on YouTube. Um, but anyway, it's a 2-minute scene where Rocky reminisces about Spider, um, and then mentions that there was a place in the desert that he liked to train.
Oh.
So that's what it was about. But again, you don't get the context, because of that scene was deleted. But so that's why they went out there.
Okay.
Um, but anyway, so then we've got the training montage out in the desert, and then it's one of those things. By the way, I'm very sun sensitive, so that was painful for me to think about.
Yeah.
Baking in the sun and doing all that labor, for all those hours. But obviously, it made him tough. And then we go back over to Moscow, and we see that Ludmila and her partner, and that they're sitting there at the fight, and then there's some official wearing some sort of uniform next to them who's like their escort or bodyguard or whatever, and so we see obviously that Ludmila, who it was mentioned was a two-time gold-winning swimmer, two-time gold medal-winning swimmer in Rocky 4. Obviously, she managed to stay in the good graces of the country.
Well, yeah, but part of that involved
Yeah.
separating herself from
Yeah.
the losers,
Yeah.
is what I'm guessing.
Yeah,
And
probably.
probably also this new boyfriend of hers, I was thinking, had
Yeah.
to be some higher up muckety muck.
Yeah,
Great Yiddish term, we call them machers,
yeah,
if you're familiar with that. So he was probably some macher.
yeah, and so anyway.
And that's the end of the fight. Now,
No. So anyway, what happens then is that Um, no, oh, I was. Oh, let me backtrack. I think that the whole Drago saga that would make a great spin-off,
Oh, sure.
and that'd be really interesting. Maybe it could make like a TV weekly soap opera about it. That could be really good,
I'll have
and
to work on that.
yeah,
He
uh,
shouldn't. Now, see, I says he shouldn't say that in front of me because when the camera goes off, I'm going to be like writing Drago.
yeah. So anyway, then what's her name? Ludmila. No, sorry, Adonis enters, and this is I've been watching sports 42 years now, and I have noticed a great change in the theatrics of introductions to athletes,
Hmm.
and now it's appropriate since Adonis's wife is a recording artist that we open to some sort of concert sequence
Right.
with her,
Yeah.
and um,
Although it lacks that, I don't even know what to call it, of Apollo coming out and
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
with James Brown, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and um,
Ooh.
and in fact, Dolph Lundgren, backing up to Rocky Four, he said that the awe that Drago showed in that scene was no act. Lundgren said he himself was just awestruck by the whole
Oh,
thing,
yeah, yeah.
and so anyway, and one thing I will say, in most ways, this movie is a very realistic portrayal of boxing. But I think, and this is a minor detail, but one of the commentators at the in the pre-fight show, mentions that despite having the belt, Adonis is a 25-1 underdog. I think that's overblown. I don't think there's any realistic scenario by which the champ would ever be that much of an underdog. I think that's just. And keep in mind, as I said earlier, in the original Rocky, the title character was a 50-1 underdog against Apollo Creed, which would be about right. And I remember when Mike Tyson was the challenger and he fought Trevor Berbick for the championship in 1986. Berbick was only a 3-1 underdog, so I think 25-1 is overblown. Um, but another side note is that one of the commentators in the movie was Roy Jones Jr., which is significant because Stallone left, I think, more than 24 voice messages with him to try to get him to be in Rocky Balboa to play Dixon, and Jones never returned the calls.
Oh, wow.
So it's interesting that he ends up in a later movie in the series years later. And I've never gotten the story, but one thing I've always wondered is if he thought it was a prank.
That's what I was
Yeah.
wondering. I was going to say, because
Yeah.
certainly in this, I definitely
Yeah.
get more like prank. I don't want to call it prank, but you
Yeah.
get more like not serious calls that
Yeah.
people claiming to be something they're not. And,
And
yeah, I could see that.
And one story I know of is Ray Parker Jr., who later went on to become a solo R&B star in the late 70s and early 80s. He was a big Motown session guy in the early years, and he hung up on Stevie Wonder 3 times when Wonder had called asking Parker to, be the guitarist in Wonder's band, and then finally the 4th time, when Parker answered, Wonder it just blurted out, "Please don't hang up. I can," and he said he could prove he was.
Yeah.
He said he could prove it was him, and I would have recognized his speaking voice, by the way, but. And then Wonder, played the piano and sang, and that's when Parker realized it was him. But
as long, I think that's great that Stevie recognized what was what had happened.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
guy wasn't just being rude.
but
he doesn't believe I'm me.
Yeah, but I remember Jim Peterick of the band Survivor, and because remember Survivor was still relatively unknown when they were hired to do Eye of the Tiger, and I remember Jim Peterick of the band saying that he got a voice message from Stallone. He wasn't sure if it was him or not, and then he called and told one of his bandmates, and he said he had gotten one too.
Okay.
So that's when they realized it was him. So yeah, I can see, especially because if you have a deep voice, Stallone isn't that hard to imitate well.
Right.
And so I can imagine, but it's hard to imagine though that Stallone, as much of a star as he is, he didn't have some way to get to some official person
Right.
to verify that it was him. But
Oh.
But anyway, so Jones missed out on that opportunity, but at least he got in,
Right.
he got into this one as a commentator. But maybe he like found out about it later and apologized. I don't know, but and like you said, Stallone apparently doesn't hold grudges.
Right.
But
Yeah.
so anyway, the fight goes on, and Victor is dominating at the beginning, and
Totally expected.
yeah, and that's what you would come to expect in the series, yeah, where the underdog has to start off badly, and then Drago is still, and at one point he gives an instruction to give a punch to the chest, and anyway, Adonis manages to hang out until the 10th round, and then makes a dramatic comeback. And some people might think that it's a stretch, but I really don't, and I'll tell you why. Because I've noticed this from not just from boxing, but from sports in general. When you've never been given a tough fight before, no matter how talented, how big and tough you are, and when you get in a tough situation for the first time, you often don't know how to get out of it. And
well, we actually discussed that again with Rocky IV, where that was something I said that Ivan never had to go past a certain round.
Yeah.
So, that's why later on, he weakened because he'd never had to go that long, and he'd never actually been physically injured during a fight, and there were all these things working against him, so it was new.
Yeah, and and I've seen it, a lot of times in a lot of sports, especially like in a lot of sports, when you're really good, you're accustomed to playing from ahead, and there's a big difference between playing from ahead
coming from behind.
Yeah, big difference between playing ahead and playing behind. And when you play from behind and you've never done it before, sometimes you panic and you don't know what to do. And then boxing, there's another aspect, because there's the whole thing about getting physically beaten down to that extent. And Tommy Morrison wasn't a very bright guy by my estimation. Certainly not a very sensible guy, but he did know boxing. He was a heavyweight champion of the world back in around 93, 94. And he said, the only way to get in shape to get hit is to get hit.
Right.
And if you've never been hit before, and the first time you get hit is in, a heavyweight title fight, you could be in trouble. So anyway, what happens is, Adonis is getting beaten down, and, obviously Ivan is just, wanting to, because he's talked to, about taking the belt this time, not just, beating him, but, getting the win, getting the championship. And then I remember, I think it was the first fight actually, when Ivan says he's scared and Victor says I know, and then Ivan says, then why is he still standing? But anyway, so then Adonis goes down, and then this is a really good moment, because you go back to the first movie, one of the big plot elements was Adonis accepting his identity as Apollo Creed's son,
right.
and reluctantly taking the name only because he had to get the fight against Pretty Ricky Conlon, and then finally embracing it at the end. And so then, the referee asks, 'cause I guess it's pretty common in boxing matches to see if somebody's still coherent, to ask them
what their name is.
Yeah.
Well, because there was a joke, if anybody remembers the TV show Taxi, where the character Tony Banta, and he was terrible fighter, as Louis used to say, he's a loser.
Yeah.
And there was a scene in the locker room where something about asking his name.
Yeah.
And Alex tells him, yeah, they asked you got it wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's kind of a thing, and he ends up saying, yeah, but when he told me what it was, I recognized it.
Okay.
So for some reason, forgive me for going off, but I always think of that scene when there's that interaction between with the boxer being asked his name. I always immediately think of that whole thing about, but when he told me what it was, I recognized it.
Yeah.
So when he's yelling Creed, it's exactly.
And I once was watching a real boxing match back in the 80s, maybe, I think it was the 80s, and then the referee actually asked the guy where he was, and I think he said New York or wherever,
Right, you have to.
Yeah. And so anyway, then after the first time, Adonis says Creed, and then the referee asks again, and then he shouts Creed, and then that's when he seems to, you know, be rejuvenated, and
Right.
then he finally, starts connecting, and obviously Victor has never been in this situation.
Right.
He's never been hit, and he's not in, you know, not accustomed to it and doesn't know how to take it, so he gets knocked down, and then gets back up, and then
Yeah.
he's so shaken that he's completely lost his composure, and then he gets knocked down again, and then Ludmila, you see her, say something to her boyfriend or whatever, and then he gets the attention of their escort,
Mhm.
and they all get up and leave, and then this is where the movie really gets emotional, and Drago sees them walk out, and there's really a very painful scene here, and even though Victor's not portrayed as being a very likable kid, is where he's trying to get up for the second time,
Mhm.
and he has this eye that's largely swollen shut, and then he sees his mother's empty seat and the two other empty
Mhm.
seats, and he sees he's been abandoned by his mother again, and it's just it's sad. It would be sad in any circumstances, but when he's there leaning on a rope, and
Mhm.
seeing this through an eye that almost is swollen shut, and then I think it's at this point when Ivan realizes that his son was right, telling him all those things back at that dinner, about these are the same people who abandoned you, and you see that now they're ready to do it again,
Mhm.
at the drop of a hat, just because things start going bad. And then one thing, that's when you notice the change, and then Ivan, he tells Victor to get up, but this time it's like half-hearted. It's
Mm.
like it's not forceful like it had been
Mhm.
before. So then Victor gets back up, and he's taken another ferocious beating, and then that's when you start to see Ivan, where you see the humanity
Mhm.
for the first time, and it's one of those things.
Now I have to,
Yeah,
before you
yeah,
give the spoiler, because I'm gonna say I have to say this in all my years of watching TV, movies, whatever. I've had times where I could say I wasn't sure how it was going to end or what was going to happen.
yeah,
Okay. Um, and there were most of the time I see something coming.
yeah. I didn't. I didn't.
Okay,
In this
right. I'm
case.
going to say too,
Yeah.
because I have to say that never though have I ever looked back on something and been so totally surprised,
Yeah.
where I was like, in a million years I never saw coming what came.
Yeah. Neither did I.
And if that's the first thing I
Yeah.
emailed you after that, I said we've got to do the super, because I never saw that coming.
Yeah.
And I'm prefacing this because I have to say right now that if you have not seen the movie yet, turn this off.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Because
Yes. Yes.
if you're watching this and you haven't seen Creed 2,
Yeah.
turn it off now.
Yeah. Okay. So
Oh.
anyway, it's one thing to know that your son is in a dangerous sport, but when you've never seen your son beaten before, it has an impact, and you see.
And especially
Yeah.
if you've, in his case, he'd experienced it before.
Yeah.
He actually had experienced that beat down.
Yeah.
So he knows personally what he's going through too. So
Yeah, and I think so he realizes. I mean, it's painful for him to see his son beaten for the first time, and obviously he's not accustomed to it, and you can see the reaction on his face,
Mhm.
how it's hurtful to him.
And like I said, he understands physically what's happening.
Yeah, and then he also understands the emotions
Mhm.
because he sees his son was just abandoned by his mother for the second time, and like I said, he realizes now that his son was right all along, about these people.
By the way, and maybe even a little bit of that. What is that? Better a live son than a dead hero.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So.
And so I think that again finally the words, he didn't take the word seriously at first, but he does now before it's too late, thankfully. Realizing that these are the same people who abandoned him, and now they're going to do the same thing to his son, and I think another thing he also is thinking about, at least subconsciously, is, do I want my son to spend the next 33 years of his life miserable because he lost a match.
Mm-hmm.
Do I want him believing that he believes that his worthiness of being loved hinges on his success in boxing?
And still, I never saw it. I mean,
Yeah.
looking at this, I didn't see it coming.
Um,
Because I'll go ahead and say it. Because he was holding that towel.
Yeah.
And he was, and I still,
Yeah.
never, in my wildest dreams, I didn't know, because I'm used to seeing Cubs rally caps where people are
Yeah.
doing whatever, you take it.
And anyway, I would have done the scene slightly differently, although it works well the way it was done. But one of the biggest plot elements of Rocky IV was Rocky, thinking about throwing the towel, and then not doing it,
Mm-hmm.
and so anyway, then you see Ivan. It looks at. I think some people thought that he was starting to walk away and abandon his son too.
That's, yeah.
And maybe that's what they tried to make you think,
Mm-hmm.
but then you see him standing up there on the apron, and he throws in the towel and saves his son.
And like I said, it's one of those moments where there'd been a look on my face.
Yeah.
That would have been interesting if I had actually accompanied you to the theater and seen that, if we'd seen it at the same time. Because I know the two of us would have been like...
Yeah, I was...
I have never, ever... so congratulations, maybe Stallone.
Yeah.
Who, as the writer, whoever did it, I never saw it coming. Congratulations. That for me is, because you and I are so scripted with film and everything, we always see it coming, whatever it is.
Yeah, I didn't,
And not this one either. So kudos. Really.
Yeah.
You did it. I never saw that coming. And I think, that, I'm saying that. Go on.
Yeah, it was an incredible, it was an incredible change there, and that you see and of course it brings back, as somebody pointed out, that's Stallone's. It goes back to Rocky IV that if I could change it, you can change. Everybody can change,
Mm-hmm.
and so you see that even Ivan Drago, who for most of the series is portrayed as cold, mean-spirited, grudge holding, and exploitive,
Mm-hmm.
and you see that there, he wasn't even beyond humanity, and
I actually liked after that because his son
Yeah.
was kind of frustrated.
yeah.
But to actually watch Ivan come in there and it's okay,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he was
and hug his son,
and coming in there, and it took him a bit to get him calmed
yeah,
down into that, but he did it, and
And-
it was very effective.
yeah, and I think that that stood out with me even more than seeing Adonis celebrate,
Mhm.
and
Me
you-
too.
and a lot of
me too.
Oh yeah, and a lot of people have made a big deal over what I think was just an ordinary line is after the fight, then Rocky just says, "Ivan, it's your time," and I didn't think that was any big deal. That was just a standard line, but yeah, the interaction between the Dragos struck me a lot more, and that then the thing is, I felt when Victor at the end when he kept getting back up, even though it was obvious he had nothing left in the tank, that he was just he saw he had been abandoned by his mother, and he was like his father, he was just trying to make his father proud,
Right. Yes.
His father, Ivan might not have been a very good father, but at least he did stick around and raise his son. That's the one good thing I'll say about him. Unlike the mother, and he and so he's just trying to make his father proud, and then finally he just needs that affirmation that you're my son and I love you, and that's okay. It doesn't matter if you lose the fight, and so
I hadn't thought about it until we were talking just now.
Yeah.
This is really good because we were going to talk about ultimately Rocky and his son, and I'm wondering if what helped push Rocky to do what he finally did was
Yeah.
seeing the Dragos come together.
It could be, yeah, it would make sense. And then there's a deleted scene that's also on YouTube, and I wish they had kept it in. Although if I talked to the powers that be, I would suspect they felt it broke up the flow between the end of the fight scene and then the epilogue. But basically, Adonis is walking back in the hall, and then the door to Victor's locker room is open, and Victor's just sitting there motionless. And then Adonis walks in, and he sits next to Victor, and then he just says, "Your life is more than one fight." And then Rocky notices that Adonis is in there and just goes in to check up on him. And then Ivan just then walks in the room, and then he just stops, and then he and Rocky look at each other, and they give each other sort of a nod of respect, and that's how it ends. The only words of the scene are just, like I said, Adonis telling Victor, "Your life is more than one fight," and and very possibly the last time that Rocky and Drago will ever see each other. So then we go to the epilogue, and I'm not. I'll preface this by saying I'm not a big cemetery visiting guy, and I'm not against.
I'm not either, and I do. Yeah.
And I'm not against going to cemeteries either. I mean, when I'm down in Madison, my hometown, Madison, Indiana, I've only been there 4 times in the last 10 years because I'm there so rarely. My all 4 of my grandparents and my Uncle Steve and my stepmother are all buried in the same cemetery. In fact, probably within 50 feet of each other. So I do when I'm down there, I do make a point to drop by the cemetery. But I don't like sit there for an hour and talk to them either. And if people do that, that's fine also, whatever comforts you, But I think that Adonis, I think he needed to, even though he started in the first movie, I think he needed to really, come to terms, to make peace with his father. Not that there was ever any estrangement, but because they never met, there's
Right.
all the things left unsaid. So he went and he said what he needed to say, and you do see something that you have some more insight to Apollo Creed, that he has this really elaborate tombstone that
Right.
has
his
his picture on it.
Yeah.
And then you see, our Rocky and Adrian, they have the very modest, modest looking tombstones. And by the way, I forgot to mention this, but you have to look closely to see it. But in the scene where Rocky's visiting the graves, there's another bottle of it looks like it's again 4 Roses bourbon on Polly's grave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Might as well leave him what he wants.
Yeah. And so, and another thing that I like, even though they cut out that scene with the Dragos in the locker room, I do like that it does show while Adonis is at his father's grave, you see this time you see the Dragos, they're now training together.
Together, right.
And now it looks like father-son bonding as opposed to slave driving.
Right. Yeah, you got it.
And I think that one thing going forward with the Dragos, I mean, I think that the scene of them training together, it's affirmation that Ivan really did learn his lesson, and even if he and Victor have both been abandoned by their country, they have each other now, and that they can go forward and have a regular life, and with Victor now having had not just 1 but 2 heavyweight title fights, presumably they have some money now.
Right.
Because I think anymore, I think I'm sure the purse would have been in the millions for those 2 fights.
Yeah.
And then finally Rocky, you see him get out of a taxi cab that has a maple leaf on it, so
Right.
you can assume he's in Canada.
And I'm going to say this is something I saw coming a mile away.
Yeah.
So, whereas they gave me something in this film that I never would have seen coming at all,
Yeah.
now came the one I saw coming a mile away.
Yeah, and even more so for me because in the 2008 movie Rambo, which is I think is partly where he got the idea for this. And at the end of the that was even though the movie was just called Rambo, it was actually the fourth movie in the series. And basically, in a nutshell, in the movie, Rambo is still living in Thailand after the events of Rambo 3 20 years earlier, and he's given up on life. And then he's a pilot of a boat, and he gives people rides. And when these humanitarian aid workers want to go to Burma, he tries to stop them because he thinks it's too dangerous, but they insist because they want to help the less fortunate. And then when he learns that they've been kidnapped, he realizes that these people were willing to give up good lives to help others, and then he finds his purpose in rescuing these people. And earlier in the movie, it's mentioned that he doesn't know if he has any family back in America, but that his father might still be living. And then finally, after he rescues these people, he goes back to America, and then the movie ends where you see him at a house, and he sees his father's name on the mailbox, and it ends with him. You don't see what happens, but you see that he's walking toward the house when the movie ends. Um, so and it was a really chilling scene for me. But so this is sort of a replay of that, but except mushier.
Yeah.
And Stallone is good at mush,
Actually,
Yeah.
on my mush
Yeah,
scale,
yeah.
it's not that mushy.
Oh, yeah. This was to
I've
me at
seen
least.
far mushier, maybe,
Yeah.
but
But at the same time, there is some realism in the scene as well. I mean, there are people who end up estranged, and sometimes the innocence of a new child can help bring people back together. And it's so anyway, he knocks on the door, and I assume that probably somebody put out a casting call to try to find the toddler who looks the most like Talia Shire.
right.
And I'd like to know how many kids they looked at, but
Oh my
the
gosh.
kid anyway. So the door opens, and I like the camera work. The door opens, and then the camera pans down. And you see it's the kid who answers the door, and Rocky says, "You must be Logan," and so it's a typical modern boy name. I guess in Canada too. And so then he says, "Yes, who are you?" And then you hear somebody say in the background, "Who is it?" And then you see that not only is it Rocky Jr., but it's Milo Ventimiglia, the most
Right.
recent actor to play the character back in Rocky Balboa 12 years earlier. And he had publicly expressed interest in being in another Rocky film, although he said he would not be offended if you were not invited. So they brought him back for about 30 seconds.
Right.
But nevertheless, it does make him the first actor to play the character twice.
Sure.
The first four did it only once. Sergio Stallone in 2, Ian Freed in 3, Rocky Krakoff in 4, and then Sage Stallone in 5. So each of Stallone's real life sons played the character once. So now Milo Ventimiglia is back, and you just wonder if Sage were alive, if it would have been him,
Yeah.
And we'll never know. But for those of you who don't know, Sage Stallone, who played Rocky Jr. in Rocky 5, died in 2012. But anyway, whatever happened in the past, it seems all is forgiven now, and Stallone and has the nice hug with his son, and then he's holding a ball, and he asks Logan if he wants to play catch, and so and then finally the movie ends with Adonis calling Bianca and Amara over to the tombstone.
Right.
And so I remember when right after I saw Rocky Balboa for the first time, and Stallone walked away, and I believed that was the end. And but yeah, I believe that was the end, and I remember thinking it was interesting that we saw the character develop over a full generation, um, and now it's been well more than that. You know, we see the character develop over 42 years, and so at the end, you know, in the epilogue, you see, you know, Rocky's grandson and Apollo's granddaughter. So
Right.
you've seen that the two young men, the primes of their lives, now have grown into grandfathers.
Fathers.
You know,
Yeah.
um, so it's a really, you know, moving moment, and so um, anyway, you know, it finishes strong, and you know, for me, I think the movie's about on par with the original Creed. There were some aspects I think it's even stronger. Then there were some aspects I think it was a little weaker. Um, I didn't. To me, from a standpoint of writing, the movie's every bit as good as the original Creed. I think actually the writing might be a little better. I think especially that now you know, we were dealing with characters. I think once you've established characters, it's easier to keep writing for them. As long as you keep the characters growing, I think sometimes characters regress. Like I mentioned, I think toward the end of the you know the first five, the last couple of films, you got to the point where some of the characters who had been there for a while, they were just doing what you expected them to do,
Right.
like Polly especially. Um, but you know, I think where the movie was a little bit disappointing, the fight sequences I didn't think were as strong this time. The training montage didn't fire me up like usual. The music, Ludwig Göransson, the Swedish composer who was a former classmate of Ryan Coogler's at USC, the University of Southern California. I loved his music for the original. He was back for Creed 2. I thought to me it just wasn't quite as good. But you know, so there were those technical aspects. I didn't like it as much. But in most aspects, I thought it was as good or better than the original Creed.
I think in general, just to, you know, if you want to toss up an
Yeah.
overall thing, I found that I enjoyed Creed 2 better than
Mm.
1. Um, just in general, I think I mentioned before, I don't know why, but I particularly found the music distracting.
Yeah.
And, you know, because all of a sudden this music came up that didn't seem to complement, but seemed to just have a take a thought process of its own.
Yeah.
You know, and you want it to. They say the best thing if you have music in a movie is if you don't notice it.
Well, you know, some, you know.
Well, for some of the scenes where it seemed like it should have been
Yeah.
complimentary music, it was just out there.
You know, but there are times when, you know, I've you know, really loved the music, you know, and been conscious of it. You know, I've loved a lot of the music in the Rocky movies, not so much
Oh,
Rocky,
me too.
not Rocky 5 so much. Because I think it was a mistake to go to rap it,
Rap.
or for that movie. I think it worked better in the original Creed because you can imagine that these characters like Adonis and Bianca listen to this kind of music.
Right, and that was the kind of thing with that is
Yeah.
that's why it kind of fit
Yeah.
what was going on in the movie.
Yeah, it was more of a black culture movie.
Right, and this, it just, I guess for me, like, especially with the training sequences, I guess I wanted the music to feel like training sequence music rather than.
Yeah, I agree.
Are you kind of following
yes,
with that?
yes,
Yeah. I guess
Yeah.
that's what I mean by it. You want it to be complementary to what you're seeing.
Yeah.
So I was expecting more, like, training sequence music,
Yeah.
but this music kicked in that sounded more like it went with Creed, the first Creed.
Well, and
Or,
I think, you know, and I just didn't think it was real good real. If it had been like in a background scene at a restaurant, you know, with Adonis and Bianca, I think it would have worked better. But
Well,
I didn't.
maybe
I didn't think
yeah.
for the scene that they used it for.
I think
you
maybe
know?
that's why I'm saying it was more distracting
yeah.
than fitting with it.
Yeah, but you know, for the most part, you know, I think you know, it's on par with the original. It improves some areas, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. But you know, I think that it's interesting that even though I didn't, the fight scenes didn't thrill. I mean, to me, my two favorite fights in the whole series are the climactic fight in Rocky Balboa and the climactic fight in Creed. I think those are the two that are the best done. But I think this movie, you know, it's interesting that as much as I love the scene of Rocky meeting his grandson, and I cried when I saw it in the theater. It was a very very moving scene, and sometimes there's something about the innocence of a child that can
Mhm.
mend people's lives, and
Mhm.
make you realize that whatever differences you have are not that important.
Mhm.
And you can imagine, especially looking at it from Rocky's perspective, that he's missed out on a few years of this boy's life
Right.
already, and finally is seeing him, and that like you said, and I didn't even think about it until you just said it, but maybe he was motivated in part seeing the reconciliation of the Dragos, and
Because you almost hear that voice going, "So what are you waiting for?" You
yeah,
know.
so he
Yeah.
you know it's but the thing that stands out in my mind the most about the movie is the way that you see the Dragos change, and that the softening, especially the softening of Ivan, and coming to realize what's important in his life before he loses it, and
Right.
that that and again I think because you do see that moment of them jogging together on the streets of Kiev, then at least it gives you a sense that everything worked out with them, and whatever happens going forward, that they're gonna, have a better relationship.
So one thing we wanted to mention, of course, before we signed off was there is apparently going to be a Creed 3.
Well, yeah, there's a few things actually are
Oh.
in motion. Let me pull this up here. Um, but I mean, was that your impression about the Dragos, that you feel like they're gonna be okay going forward?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh.
Good. I just
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
was trying to make sure we got that in.
And oh yeah, we will. Yeah, I've got it right here. But anyway, it's I think there was enough assurance, but I think that shot of them in the jogging scene, I think it was
Yeah.
like the final thing to cement that their relationship is improving, and
Mhm.
that they're
Right.
they have that bond now,
Oh.
where basically Victor no longer feels. I think Victor is now feeling like his father loves him, no matter what he does as a boxer,
Mhm.
which is what we all need to feel.
Right.
So
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, I guess you have to forgive me when you
yeah,
said moving
yeah, oh
forward
yeah,
immediately. I
I
was
know.
on the next sequel.
Yeah,
So.
well, sometimes I think there's still things that I think back to, and
Right.
I'll probably, after we're off the air, I'll probably think of more.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, a few months ago, Michael B. Jordan did confirm that there will be a Creed 3 now, and here's what it says currently on the Wikipedia entry. So a lot here. When asked about plans for Creed 3, Stallone stated that he would like Deontay Wilder to play the son of Clubber Lang, to which Jordan agreed if a sequel was made.
I was gonna say I was wondering if they were gonna bring
Yeah.
back Clubber.
And I'll tell you that I would be open to that, but one thing I would want to make sure is that it's not going to be a rehash.
Of this. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There would have to. I'd hope they'd find something different and interesting.
Mhm.
And so I remember when I was a kid, it was speculated that someday there would be movies about Rocky Jr. as the main character. And I remember even saying then, when I was much younger and less wise than I am now, I remember thinking that if that was going to work, it would have to be something more compelling than merely Rocky Jr. trying to be the heavyweight champion of the world. There would have to
Right.
be a better story there than just
Right.
that. So yeah, I mean, certainly, and again, we know very little about Clubber Lang also.
Right.
So you'd have a lot of room to develop the character like you did with Ivan in
Oh,
this
yeah.
character. And although again, we did get a little bit of a window into Ivan's soul, in the scene where he did say, "I fight to win for
Mhm.
me." Um, but yeah, Stallone took that and really, really did a great job building on it. So anyway, then after that, the next thing it says in the article, it says in July 2019, it was announced that the Rocky franchise as a whole will continue with another mentor-student film, a la Creed, set post-Creed 2, in which Rocky Balboa would befriend a young fighter who is an undocumented immigrant.
Hmm.
That's timely.
Yes.
Stallone stated, quote, "Rocky meets a young angry person who got stuck in this country when he comes to see his sister. He takes him into his life and unbelievable adventures begin. and they wind up south of the border. It's very, very timely, end of quote. And I'll tell you, that has great potential, but one thing I hope, and let's go back to, Michelle previously made a short called Soldier Song, and we do a super deep movie analysis on that as well. And one thing I've commented about in that episode and to others on several occasions over the years, the movie is about post traumatic stress disorder and soldier suicides. And one thing I like about the movie is that it's nonpartisan. It's not a Democrat movie or a Republican movie, and it addresses its points without trying to force you to take one side or another politically. And if this movie is made that is mentioned here, I hope it stays nonpartisan.
Oh yes.
I hope it doesn't stay as. I hope it doesn't become just some anti-Trump thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Stallone's a Republican, so it probably won't. But but nevertheless, I mean, there's so many people in Hollywood who hate Trump so much who would
Right.
love any chance to bash him. And I'm not going to comment on my opinion about Trump in this episode because this is not the correct forum for it. I'll be glad to talk to you about that off list. If you want to email me, I'll give you my opinion. But one thing I will say about Trump that I would say about any president in office: don't forget he is a fellow human being, and whatever you think about his policies, if you don't like his policies, fight his policies, but don't ever treat another human being as less than such. One of my favorite lines in movie history is in the original. No, it's in the Karate Kid Part 2, where the Ralph Macchio character is asking his mentor who served in World War II if he ever killed anybody, and his answer was unfortunately yes. And then the Macchio character said, "Yeah, but they were enemies, right?" And then his mentor said, "Yes, but they were also people," which is a great line because I think so many times we forget about the humanity of people just because we don't like them or because they're on the other side or whatever. So yeah.
What I'm just going to add is I'm sure there is a way to do that nonpartisan. And
There is. And I hope Stallone will do it.
Yes.
And it's the story has great potential. And so I really hope it'll be a good one. And there's one thing, Stallone, I feel like he made a lot of bad choices in some of the action movies he did in the 80s, and then just last year he made a new Rambo movie, and I read what I read about it, because I've seen a couple of the Rambo movies. I decided not to see this one because what I read about it was very disturbing, about the level of gore that it was supposedly. It had the gore level of a slasher movie, and even David Morrell, who created the character of John Rambo, said the movie made him embarrassed to be associated with it. But anyway, the last scene of the movie, if you want to see it, just go type in Rambo Last Blood final scene. And the thing is, I didn't want to see it because of what I read about it, but I felt that to give an opinion on it, I had to see it to give an educated opinion, and I saw it once, and it's one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. And I mean, the character Rambo, when he's killed people in the past, at least in the movies I saw, it was at least in the course of defending people.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a guy. Yes, he was the main bad guy of the movie, but he was also restrained and at this time unable to defend himself. And anyway, Rambo performs a very disgusting act that is.
Well.
And to me, what it struck me is it's like Stallone trying to say, "Hey, I'm still a badass at 73." That's what I thought. I thought it was really disappointing for a guy who I think has made so many strides over the years in making movies of greater substance.
Well, that sounds like a whole other episode
Yes,
of this show.
it is. Anyway, yeah, if you want to see it, you can find it on YouTube. But be forewarned, it's a scene that makes me wonder what you have to do to get an NC-17 rating.
Okay.
Because if this doesn't get it, it's hard to imagine what it would take. But anyway, and like I said, I think Stallone, really starting with Rocky Balboa, that's when he decided he wanted to make real good, high quality movies
Yeah.
rather than just exciting movies again. So anyway, then there's one other thing here. In addition, Stallone announced the development of a Rocky prequel television series,
Hmm.
and that's one of those things I'll take a wait and see approach.
Right.
The closest thing I remember to that is there was a TV series that ran on the A&E network for 5 seasons from 2013 to 2017 called Bates Motel, which
Oh.
told the story of Norman Bates and his mother in the years before the original Psycho. However, it should be noted the TV series took place in the present day rather than going back to, you know,
Hmm.
like the 50s or whatever.
Oh.
And it took place in Oregon, although they did have a replica of the house. And I watched the first season. I thought it was fairly good, and it seemed to be a pretty good depiction of the character in a modern day at that period of his life. With going through obviously an unhealthy childhood. Um, so we'll wait and see if it is done. If the TV series is done, I will watch it with interest. I hope that the guy doesn't, whoever plays Rocky, doesn't just try to imitate Stallone, because I think that would turn out, when you try to imitate another actor,
Right.
the best you're going to be is a second-rate version, and probably worse. So I hope he will do something that honors the character but makes it his own. And
Well, I guess, like you said, I guess we'll have to see on that.
yeah, and it certainly would be interesting,
Yeah.
and and I would like to see some stuff about the Dragos, like some kind of spin-off there, maybe that could be our project,
We'll have to see what we can do about
at
that.
least do some fan fiction or something. But sadly, though, there have been a few losses since we last did a Rocky-related episode. Let me. We've had a few deaths in the Rocky family, unfortunately, and first of all, John G. Avildsen, the director of the original Rocky as well as of Rocky Five. Let me see. He died of pancreatic cancer, which my stepmother died of as well. So I'm very sensitive to it. But anyway, since I've seen it up close, he died on June 16th, 2017, at age 81, and then also Tony Burton, who plays Duke in the first 6 Rocky movies. He died. Let me pull this up here. Pull up his profile here. And by the way, it should be noted that that Duke was Tony Burton. He and Burt Young and Sylvester Stallone were the only 3 people who appeared on screen in each of the first 6 Rocky movies. And then Stu Nahan, the late commentator, his voice appeared in all of them. But anyway, where is it? Anyway, okay, here, yeah, Tony Burton. He died. Let's see, February 25th, 2016, at the age of 78 from pneumonia. And in fact, he only made 2 films after Rocky Balboa. So certainly that's another sad loss to the series. And then finally, one that's more obscure that I discovered actually in an unusual way. In recent years, I've been hunting down a lot of the movies that I saw on Showtime as a kid in the early '80s. And are you there? Or do you have to go here in a bit? Okay, how soon? How soon do we have to get out of here?
15.
Okay. All right. All right. We'll be done. I'll be done in a few minutes. Okay. I'll finish the story and then we'll sign off. But anyway, I've been seeing all these movies that I saw on Showtime in the early '80s, and one of them was I just saw recently. It's a psychological thriller from 1980 called The Hearse, which stars Trish Van Devere. I saw it on Showtime once around 1982 or '83, and I saw that somebody had uploaded it on YouTube, the whole movie, so I watched it again, and I barely remembered it. And anyway, the movie is about this this recently divorced woman who's inherited this house that her aunt lived in, who died. Well, she was left the house by her mother, who had been left it by the Trish Vanderveer character's aunt, who died 30 some years earlier. So anyway, the main character goes out to this house, and wouldn't you know, it turns out to be haunted.
Of course.
But that's bad enough. But not only that, but when she's out on the road in this small town, you know, when she's out at night, this hearse keeps coming out and taunting her, you know, and trying to run her off the road, things like that. And anyway, you actually see the driver of the hearse, and he doesn't say anything the whole movie. But I got chills looking at him because he looks so sinister and evil. And it's like, my God, this it's like if I had to draw a picture of what I thought Satan looked like, it might be something like this guy.
Okay.
And anyway, then I just went to his IMDb profile to see if he had ever been in anything else. And so I went, and you know how like at the top of your IMDb profile it says like so and so is an actor known for.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it says that he was known for Rocky IV, and then I was like, wait a minute, and then I thought, and I realized who it was. He's the guy in Rocky IV who picks up Rocky, Paulie, and Duke when they arrive in the USSR and drives them to the cabin.
Talk about obscure.
Yeah, and his name is Dominic Bartow. And anyway, what I wonder is if maybe somebody involved in Rocky IV had seen the hearse and thought, wow, that guy, the driver is creepy. We ought to make him the driver in Rocky IV, which came out 5 years later. So maybe that was the reason. Maybe somebody thought he looked evil also and thought, you know, maybe this is the guy that we ought to get to be the driver. Maybe it'll look more sinister. But anyway, yeah, so it's odd. It would be an odd coincidence if it were unrelated, but you know, I think probably somebody did see the movie and thought, we got to get this guy to be the driver, you know. And anyway, I looked him up to see if I could find any, because his last IMDb credit was 1996, but I looked up, and I did a search for him online. I found an obituary for him. He died last year, and what's odd is that his obituary made no mention of his acting career, which. And he had 48 credits dating from 1969 to 96. But anyway, so I add, and the reason I know it was not a different guy with the same name is because his obituary mentioned his date of birth as December 20th, 1930, which was also on his IMDb profile. So I added in the date of death, which was April 10th of last year. But anyway, that was just an odd. What's really odd is that sometimes, you know, you see people in multiple movies and not realize it's the same person. And as soon as I saw Rocky IV, it's like, oh yeah, that's who it is.
Oh,
but I don't
have to see it after.
Yeah, I just didn't realize. It was hard for me to connect the two. It's like I saw it for years. I didn't realize that the guy who played Duke was also the same guy who played Larry Durkin in The Shining. Even though they look exactly the same in both movies, I guess it's just because the movies are so different.
And I always say you're out of context.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like when I taught preschool, and one of the students would see me someplace outside of the preschool.
Yeah.
And they'd look at me like, I'm totally out of context.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was just. So I wanted, even though sorry to have to report his death, I'm glad to at least end on a somewhat lighthearted note. Because it was pretty funny, but it's funny that I didn't realize who he was, and so all right, well, any last words?
No, I guess not.
Okay, all right, well, anyway,
I always say again, we went longer than the actual movie, right? And
yes. Yeah.
Always remember, if the analysis does go longer than the actual movie, that is a super deep movie analysis. Yeah,
well, we still didn't set our record was 3 hours and 3 minutes with Rocky Balboa, and
oh, really?
Yeah, because I thought that went too long. I know I intentionally cut Creed short when we did the Creed episode.
Yeah.
There were times when I thought I had more to say about something, but I moved on because I didn't want to weigh it down too much. My goal was for this to be between 2.5 hours. We're at 2:49, so we're not too much over. So anyway, Thanks to Michelle, as always, for her 12th appearance here on Super Deep Movie Analysis. Yeah, I'm sure she'll be back with some more guest episodes. I'm sure she'll be back with some more guest hosting in our future episodes. And I don't know when or what the next episode is going to be, but hopefully we'll get another one here in the next few weeks because I really miss doing these on a regular basis. They've been pretty sparse the last 2 or 3 years, but I've seen quite a few movies lately that I really have a lot to say about. So, and hopefully the movies that I'm making and Michelle's making will, hopefully people will have a lot to say about them one of these days. But if anybody ever, does one of these episodes on one of, our movies, will be greatly appreciative and honored. Even if you hate the movie and trash it, at least you took the time to say something about it. So
let us know.
Yeah. So, all right. Any last words before? Okay. Well, anyway, look forward to whatever the future holds for the Rocky Creed series, and whenever they're back with a new episode or series or movie, we'll be there to talk about it, the trailers and the movie both. So.
And check out my interview show, On the Couch with Michelle Gussow, available on YouTube.
Yeah, that's good. It's a good show. I've been in a couple episodes, and done camera on a couple of episodes as well. So, anyway, thanks again. Thanks to Michelle, and thanks to Sylvester Stallone and all the people who made these 8 movies that have touched our lives so deeply, and hope for many more. And I'm glad to see that the timeless message of perseverance and faith, hope, and love, and everything else is still inspiring people nearly 50 years after the original Rocky, and hopefully there's still a lot more in the tank. So, and by the way, keep in mind that Sylvester Stallone's mother is still 98.
Right.
She's 98 and still living. So, Stallone could be back for a few more go rounds. So
there you go.
All right. So this concludes this season premiere of season 6. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I cordially invite you to do so again in the future for another episode. Until then, for Super Deep Movie Analysis, this is Lec Zorn and Michelle Gussow reminding you, there is a difference only you can make.